The uncertainty loop paradox. Time travel, at first glance, is a marvel of possibility. A dream woven into the fabric of science fiction, it tempts the mind with the idea of returning to the past or leaping into the future. Yet beneath the excitement lies a creeping, chaotic paradox, one not about changing events or meeting your younger self, but about the collapse of certainty itself. It's called the uncertainty loop paradox, and it doesn't begin with paradoxes of logic, it begins with quantum chaos. Every time you travel through time, you introduce subtle quantum disturbances into the universe, minute ripples in the foundational probabilities that govern everything. These aren't just metaphorical ripples, they are real shifts in the fundamental uncertainties that define particles, states, and outcomes. And each time jump adds more. Imagine a world in which time travelers go back and forth freely. With each leap, they create branching possibilities, alternative quantum arrangements that weren't there before. The universe doesn't just accept these changes passively, it adapts, recalculates, and continues. But the more it adapts, the more uncertain it becomes. With each successive time journey, the rules that govern cause and effect begin to fray. What was once a stable chain of events becomes a swirling sea of probability. Events become harder to predict, coincidences multiply, the laws of physics remain, but their outcomes blur. It's as if the universe is trying to hold on to coherence while being spun in a centrifuge of temporal distortion. This paradox doesn't hinge on human error or paradoxical loops like killing your grandfather. It relies on something far more subtle and disturbing: quantum decoherence. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in probabilistic states. Their positions, velocities, and even identities are smeared across possibilities until an observation collapses them into a definite state. But when you time travel, especially to the past, you carry forward a state that has already been collapsed. You reintroduce certainty into an uncertain moment. That act destabilizes the quantum environment. It's like throwing a rigid object into a pool of fluid. The shock ripples out in all directions. And with each additional journey, the ripples compound. Initially, these disturbances are negligible. The first-time traveler might never notice. But over time, and with more travelers, the disturbances multiply. The probabilistic fabric begins to fray. You might predict rain and instead get snow. A machine that should operate flawlessly begins to misfire. Systems relying on stability, economies, governments, even biological organisms start experiencing fluctuations. Cells mutate without cause. Memories shift. People recall events differently, even though timelines haven't officially changed. It's not a Mandela effect caused by timeline jumps. It's a quantum erosion of coherence. The universe, in its essence, is a balance of entropy and structure. While entropy drives randomness, the structure provides temporary order, galaxies, stars, cells, civilizations. Time travel, under this paradox, injects so much entropy that structure begins to collapse. Not in dramatic explosions, but in subtle degradations. Music becomes harder to compose because tonal expectations fail. Mathematical proofs lose consistency. Logic itself, once the bedrock of reason, starts bending in strange and unpredictable ways. You might flip a coin 100 times and get heads 98 times, not because someone rigged it, but because statistical expectation has eroded. And as this continues, a threshold is reached. There comes a point where the uncertainty is so great that the very act of time travel can no longer function. The systems that allow you to calculate coordinates in space-time become unreliable. The engines that channel temporal energy become unstable. You enter your destination as July 14th, 1965, and arrive in an undefined smear of years. Or worse, you arrive and find a world where cause and effect no longer align, where stepping on a leaf causes an earthquake, or where speaking a word causes silence to ripple backward in time. In this universe, not even consciousness is immune. Thoughts begin to misalign. The distinction between memory and prediction blurs. People begin dreaming futures they never live and recalling pasts that never happened. It's as though the brain, a quantum system itself, starts losing its grip on linear experience. You can't trust your own thoughts, not because you're going mad, but because your neural firing patterns have been scrambled by the quantum turbulence introduced by too many time travelers. The mind becomes a hall of mirrors, past, present, and future, folding into each other like pages torn from different books and glued together randomly. The paradox deepens when we realize that even the awareness of uncertainty becomes uncertain. You might feel like you're in a stable timeline. You might believe nothing has changed, but that belief is itself a quantum event, altered by previous interferences. You might be wrong, and have no way of knowing it. Logic cannot help you because logic presupposes stability. Prediction becomes impossible because prediction requires pattern. Even language begins to fail, as words lose their causal tether. Tomorrow might mean the past. Always might mean once. The more time travelers attempt to fix these distortions, the worse they get, because every fix is a new interference. At its heart, the uncertainty loop paradox suggests that the more you try to master time, the more you unravel the very medium through which time flows. It's a cosmic irony. In seeking control, you destroy the foundation of control. In seeking to change the past or ensure the future, you dissolve the fabric that makes past and future distinguishable. Like a snake eating its own tail, time travel creates a loop that devours reality, not in an instant, but incrementally. Like digital noise overtaking an analog signal, it begins quietly, but eventually drowns out the entire message. Let's say, for the sake of thought experiment, we try to model this decay. On your first time jump, there is a 0.001% increase in uncertainty across a local region. By the 10th jump, it's 0.01%. By the 100th, the impact becomes systemic. 1,000,000 jumps, and now we live in a world where every quantum event is slightly off, a universe nudged permanently out of alignment. And because time travel doesn't have to be linear, these jumps can overlap. You could have 10,000 travelers arriving at the same point from different futures, compounding their quantum residue. It's not a loop in the traditional sense. It's a feedback loop. The more you travel, the worse the signal becomes, until the signal is just noise. Eventually, this noise hits a wall. Time travel becomes theoretically possible, but practically unusable. The calculations needed to navigate space-time collapse under quantum variability. It's like trying to sail through a storm so dense that every compass spins at random. Even if you could survive the journey, you wouldn't know where or when you'd land. The very concept of destination becomes meaningless. And once this level of distortion is reached, there's no reversing it. Because the uncertainty isn't just in time machines or physical systems. It's in the laws of reality itself. And here lies the darkest twist. The paradox implies that once this quantum uncertainty is too great, not even the memory of what used to be can survive. We might already be living in the aftermath of such a loop. Maybe ancient civilizations once mastered time travel, explored it, and reached this threshold. Maybe they saw the rising unpredictability, the unraveling of cause and effect, and maybe, by the time they realized the cost, it was too late. All records corrupted, all timelines blurred. Only vague myths and inexplicable phenomena left behind. Ghosts of coherence in a reality quietly warped by the ambitions of time walkers. You could ask, if reality becomes this uncertain, wouldn't it simply collapse? Wouldn't the universe cease to exist? Not necessarily. It might continue, just without rules, without narrative, without logic, a dreamlike state where moments occur without sequence and cause and effect play a game of dice. In such a universe, you could exist forever and yet never know who you are. You could speak without meaning, act without consequence. The uncertainty loop doesn't destroy the universe, it strips it of context. And so, the ultimate irony of time travel is revealed. In reaching back to touch the past, we loosen our grip on the present. In jumping forward to master the future, we fall into a spiral of unpredictability. And eventually, like a circuit overloaded by its own feedback, the system shorts. Not with a bang, but with a whisper of incoherence. The world still exists, but not as we knew it. So if you had the chance to step into a time machine today, would you? If you knew that every journey added to a quiet, creeping unraveling of the very fabric of reality, would the risk still feel worth it? Perhaps you'd still go, thinking one trip couldn't hurt, but so did everyone else. The first tear is always the smallest, and the last one is too late to repair. In the end, the uncertainty loop paradox doesn't warn us against time travel because of paradoxes or timelines. It warns us because of the quiet corrosion of order. A universe not ripped apart by catastrophe, but eroded by ambition, until even time itself forgets how to pass. Observer, effect, collapse. At the heart of quantum theory lies a strange, almost mystical truth. Reality is not entirely real until it is observed. In the quantum world, particles exist in a state of possibility, known as a superposition, where all outcomes are equally likely until an observer arrives. Observation collapses the waveform. Possibility becomes actuality. But what happens when an observer steps not only into a lab or a moment, but across the boundaries of time itself? What if a time traveler, carrying knowledge and perception from the future, becomes the observer of a moment that had never known them? This is the start of the observer effect collapse. A time traveler does not simply witness events like a fly on the wall. By observing the past, they engage with it on a fundamental level. In the quantum view of things, observation is not passive, it is participatory. The very act of looking at something alters what it is. And when you observe the past, you collapse waveforms that were never meant to be collapsed by you. You insert an observer into a moment that had previously existed without one, and in doing so, you change what actually happened. Not by touching anything, not by speaking, but by seeing. And that alone is enough. Let's imagine a moment in history, say a leaf falling from a tree in a quiet forest 300 years ago. In that moment, the trajectory of the leaf was not precisely determined. It fluttered on the breeze, guided by a million subtle factors: wind currents, humidity, the presence of insects. In quantum terms, that leaf existed in a range of possible paths until it was observed, likely by no one. Nature collapsed the waveform in its own quiet way, but now introduce a time traveler who steps into that forest and watches the leaf fall. Their presence is not neutral. Their act of seeing replaces nature's quiet collapse with one tied to their observation. The leaf now falls a different way. Because it must, because the wave collapsed under a different set of terms. It may seem like a minor change, meaningless even, but quantum effects ripple outward. A shift in the leaf's fall affects the insect that narrowly avoids it. That insect lands somewhere else. A predator misses a meal. A chain begins. Small, subtle, undetectable at first, but the longer the time traveler observes, the more reality bends under their gaze. They are a foreign observer, a foreign variable. Their consciousness was not originally part of that moment, but now it is. And this moment becomes one that never happened the same way. That is the observer effect collapse in its infancy. Time travel, under this lens, is not about changing grand events. It's about changing the underlying quantum decisions that reality makes in each moment. The The traveler thinks they are just watching, but their watching is in action. Their attention is in influence. Their presence rewrites the probabilities. And because time is now a loop where the observer is present in the past, the loop never settles. The waveform collapses, re-expands, and collapses again. Each observation changes what was, but what was has already shaped the observer. This forms a feedback loop, where the observer modifies the event, and the modified event alters the observer's memory, which then shifts their observation if they repeat it. This instability doesn't happen all at once. It grows. Subtle differences emerge in repeated trips. The traveler recalls seeing the sky turn gold at sunset, but on their next journey, it seems a duller orange. They recall hearing a specific bird song in a specific moment, but now it's missing. Did their memory fail them? No. The observation itself altered what was observed. The past has become unstable, not because of contradiction, but because of recursive attention. Like two mirrors reflecting each other, each bounce of observation distorts the previous one. Imagine this on a larger scale. A time traveler begins studying the events of a war, perhaps to understand the precise psychological moment a soldier decides to charge or retreat. Each visit involves watching, observing, perhaps even recording with devices. The soldier is unaware of the observer, yet still quantum waveforms collapse differently due to the new consciousness present. In one loop, the soldier hesitates. In the next, he runs. These changes bleed outward. The war takes a different path. The traveler returns home, only to find subtle but significant differences in history books. Books they memorized before. The battle's outcome remains, but the path changed. And this change is not fixed. It shifts with every trip. The feedback loop intensifies as more moments are observed. Each observation spawns a new collapse of reality. These collapses overwrite what had already been settled by time's natural flow. But the universe resists this uncertainty. It tries to stabilize, to reconcile the presence of a future observer in a past that didn't contain them. And in trying to stabilize, it oscillates. Reality flickers. It adapts, then readjusts. It cannot ignore the observer, but it also cannot reconcile the observer's contradiction. The paradox does not explode violently. It undulates. Like a poorly tuned frequency, like a tone just slightly off pitch. It rings wrong. Eventually, reality enters a phase of recursive reinterpretation. It no longer knows which version is the real one. Was the leaf always meant to fall to the left, or did it fall right first, then left? Did the soldier charge or freeze? The universe holds both memories in quantum echo, each observation layering upon the last, and the traveler, believing they're uncovering truth, is in fact feeding the instability. With each look back, they deepen the loop. Each step into the past is a trigger. Each gaze is a rewrite. Some theorists imagine that consciousness itself is the ultimate quantum observer. If that's true, then each conscious time traveler brings an impossible weight. They carry the expectation of knowing what happened. But in quantum terms, there is no what happened until it is observed. The past is only stable because it has settled through unobserved wave functions. When a time traveler reintroduces observation, they disrupt that settling. It's like lifting hardened wax with warm hands. The form is lost. The shape softens. Observation, in the quantum sense, is not just seeing, it is defining. And you cannot define something twice without contradiction. Over time, this process does not just affect isolated events. It seeps into the entire structure of cause and effect. If the past constantly rewrites itself under the pressure of repeated observation, then the present becomes a collage of versions. Your memories shift, your surroundings alter subtly. The foundation of logic begins to wobble. Events that were once secure begin to blur at the edges. Photos look different. Sentences in old books seem rearranged. You doubt your mind, but it is not your mind. It is the reality around you that is buckling under the weight of too many observers looking backward. Eventually, the time traveler must ask, is this collapse reversible? Can reality settle again if we stop observing? The answer, troublingly, may be no, because even the decision to stop is an observation. Even the act of turning away is registered by the quantum field. Consciousness has left its trace. The moment has been touched. Like footprints in snow, it cannot be undone. You can step back, but you cannot unstep. The waveforms once collapsed do not rebound. They move forward, altered. And the more observations accumulate, the more they interfere with one another. It is no longer a stream of events. It is a storm. This is not the grandfather paradox. It is not about contradictions in events. It is deeper, more elusive. It is about quantum collapse loops, the kind of paradox that doesn't scream but whispers, that doesn't explode but erodes, the kind that convinces you everything is fine until one day nothing feels quite real anymore. The world looks the same but doesn't resonate the same. You hear a melody and feel you've heard it differently before. You greet a friend and wonder if they've always had that voice. It's not déjà vu, it's decoherence. And perhaps the greatest danger is that you won't notice when the collapse is complete. There is no warning siren, no grand finale. The observer effect collapse is silent. It doesn't destroy the world, it redefines it. Slowly, layer by layer, observation after observation. Each traveler, each gaze, each curiosity, folding reality inward like a recursive dream. You don't see the shift, you feel it in the cracks. Subtle wrongness like a word mispronounced or a room slightly colder than memory. Thousand tiny mismatches that form a new consistency, a new normal born from fragmented truth. In the end, the paradox reveals something terrifying and profound. The universe is not indifferent to us. It watches us watch it. And when we pierce through time to observe what we should never have seen, it does not punish us, but it changes. And so do we. A traveler doesn't need to interfere to cause catastrophe. All they have to do is look, and the past becomes something it never was, observed, defined, and therefore rewritten. So if you ever find a way to glimpse the past, resist the urge to look too closely. For every moment you observe, the universe observes you back, and in doing so, it forgets what it was. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in accommodation. The past reshapes itself for the observer, and soon you no longer know what was ever real. You only know what you've seen, and what you've seen is already gone. The immunity paradox. Time travel has always been imagined as a tool of immense possibility, a method by which we might correct the mistakes of the past, undo catastrophes, and shape the world into something better. It's tempting, even noble, to go back in time and stop a war, prevent an assassination, or in this case, stop the outbreak of a deadly virus before it ever begins. A traveler armed with future knowledge identifies the root cause of a pandemic and makes a small, seemingly harmless intervention. A contaminated animal isn't sold at a market. A doctor is warned before misdiagnosis. A local outbreak is quietly contained before it spreads. And just like that, the virus that once devastated populations never emerges. A victory, or so it seems. When the traveler returns to the future, expecting to witness a healthier world, they are met with something far worse. A new outbreak, far deadlier, far faster, and completely unanticipated. The disease spreads in hours instead of weeks. Mortality rates skyrocket. Hospitals collapse under the weight of a virus humanity was completely unprepared to face. And it's only then that the traveler begins to understand the paradox they have unleashed. By preventing the original virus, they also erased humanity's slow, painful buildup of resistance. The vaccines, the immune responses, the global awareness, all of it vanished with a single change. Now, in the absence of any historical exposure, the population stands utterly defenseless. This is the immunity paradox. It is not about conflicting timelines or contradictions of logic. It is about the hidden costs of mercy. The traveler's intervention, while well-meaning, removed not only suffering, but the immunity that came with it. In the real timeline, humanity had battled the virus, adapted, learned, and built layers of defense, biological, social, psychological. People had antibodies, systems, awareness, but in this new timeline, none of that exists. The immune system, like any adaptive mechanism, requires a challenge to grow stronger. Without that challenge, it remains naive, untrained. And when the next viral threat comes, it sweeps through a population, as vulnerable as dry tinder in a lightning storm. The cruelty of this paradox is that the traveler did not bring the new virus with them. It evolved naturally. But it evolved in a world without memory. A world where no one had reason to expect it. No protocols to prevent it, no strength to fight it. In the original timeline, mutations were slowed by widespread resistance. Here, the absence of that resistance acts as an accelerant. The virus is faster, smarter. It doesn't need to adapt around immune systems. It walks straight through the front door. And in days, society begins to unravel. At first, the traveler doesn't believe it. How could saving lives result in even greater loss? They had studied the original virus for years, traced its spread, mourned its victims. Their journey was meant to be one of healing. But what they failed to understand is that time is not a straight line. It's a web. Every strand touches another. Pull one, and you shift the entire structure. Preventing a past suffering is not a deletion, it's a redirect. The energy doesn't disappear, it moves, delays. In the old timeline, herd immunity had slowly formed. Survivors passed antibodies to their children. Public health systems grew vigilant. Scientists built treatments atop treatments. But in this altered world, none of those foundations exist. It's not just the immune system that's unprepared. It's the culture. People don't wash hands. Medical research skipped entire fields. Politicians have no memory of public health emergencies. It's as if a generation was lulled into complacency by the absence of pain. And now, when danger arrives, they face it like a child would a storm. Afraid, unarmored, and unaware. The traveler watches helplessly. Every move they made to prevent the virus now echoes in failure. The market they shut down was never studied. The doctors they warned never trained for virology. Even the hospital funding shifts. Why invest in something that never went wrong? This world, untouched by the original virus, redirected its priorities. It turned its back on invisible threats. And that ignorance, while understandable, and yet the paradox deepens. In the timeline the traveler left, they were celebrated for their brilliance, but they carried the weight of loss. Loved ones had died. Millions had suffered. The scars were deep, but they were known. Now, in this altered world, those people never died, but different ones do. The traveler, immune from the new virus due to their original exposure, becomes a ghost in a sickened future, immune, but isolated, watching as a civilization collapses under the weight of a disease it was never meant to face. They try to warn people, try to offer a cure, but the virus is not the same. It has mutated in directions no one anticipated. The old knowledge is obsolete. Their immunity is meaningless to others. The blood samples, once valuable, now confuse researchers. It's not the same virus. It's worse. And the traveler realizes something chilling. By removing the original evolutionary pressure, they didn't just delay the virus, they fed it. The absence of struggle gave it space to grow in silence. In a sense, they didn't prevent a pandemic, they incubated one. What's most haunting about the immunity paradox is that there's no clean solution. The traveler could go back again, allow the original virus to spread, but with that choice comes a new moral cost. Do they let people suffer, knowing it leads to a stronger future? Or do they intervene again, only to risk birthing yet another, more cunning disease? Every intervention writes a new future, but with each rewrite, immunity weakens. Nature learns, but so does the virus. And the more times the past is changed, the more chaotic the consequences become. Eventually, the traveler faces a decision no one should have to make. Do nothing. Let time unfold. Let people suffer. Trust in the slow, cruel intelligence of evolution. Trust that exposure builds strength, even if the price is high. It's a bitter truth that sometimes immunity must be earned through hardship. That sometimes suffering is not a flaw in the system, but a step in its design. To erase all pain is to erase all preparation. To rescue the past may be to endanger the future. The traveler, once filled with hope, now walks through a hollow world. Streets are empty, cities locked down. The new virus has no name, yet it spread too quickly. It broke systems before they could respond. Children are sick. Elders fall first. And the traveler, immune but powerless, understands what they've done. Not by malice, not by greed, but by misunderstanding the balance. They believed in cause and effect, but time doesn't play by such clean rules. It plays by loops, echoes, and reversals. The immunity paradox is not just a warning about time travel, it is a lesson about intervention itself. That even with the best intentions, meddling in complex systems often brings consequences too vast to predict. That curing the past can weaken the present. That immunity, whether of the body or the mind, is forged in fire, not in avoidance. And perhaps, in this new future, someone else will rise. Someone who survives the new virus and starts the cycle again. Someone who travels back and sees a quiet market, a silent mutation, a moment of decision, and maybe they'll intervene. Or maybe they'll pause. Feel the weight of the past's absence and choose instead to let history breathe. Not because they are cold, but because they understand, because they've learned what it means to carry immunity, not just in the blood, but in the wisdom of restraint. In the end, the traveler is left with a paradox not of time, but of healing. That the cure can be the cause, that the safest world is not the one free from disease, but the one that remembers it, and that sometimes, to save the future, you must let the past unfold, untouched, as painful as it may be. Because only through that struggle does true resilience grow. The sympathy ripple. Time travel, in the grandest sense, is often portrayed as an instrument of logic, used to fix mistakes, solve puzzles, or reshape history with surgical precision. But what if the greatest shift in the timeline didn't come from a war averted or a life saved, but from something far smaller? A glance, a gesture, a moment of human kindness extended across time. That's where the sympathy ripple begins, not with strategy, but with a traveler from the future, stepping quietly into the past, notices a young boy crying on the edge of a crowded street. No history book recorded his name, no disaster looms around him, but the traveler feels something stir, a thread of empathy, and sits beside the boy, offering a few gentle words and a moment of comfort. That one act, insignificant by most metrics, becomes the seed of global change. What the traveler cannot foresee is how profoundly that small act of connection will radiate. The boy, previously dismissed by those around him, carries that moment forward. He treats others with unexpected kindness. He grows up believing people are inherently good. That belief softens his voice during arguments, makes him a bridge where others would become barriers. One person, influenced by empathy, becomes a teacher who encourages children differently. One of those children becomes a diplomat who believes in peaceful negotiation. A tense summit, years later, ends with a handshake instead of a walkout. A war that could have begun doesn't. All of it rooted in one silent moment on a street that history never marked. The traveler moves on, unaware. This is the essence of the sympathy ripple. It's not about the mechanics of time, but the fragility of emotional resonance. Human interactions are like threads in a tapestry. Tug on one and the entire pattern shifts. Change a mood and you change a conversation. Change a conversation and you change a decision. Over time, these small shifts aggregate into tectonic emotional movements. The traveler's one moment of compassion ripples outward across decades, subtly rewiring the tone of human connection. Societies grow slightly more trusting, policy decisions lean just a degree more toward peace. But even a degree, stretched over centuries, bends the course of the world. The traveler, believing they had only paused for a moment, eventually returns to their own time, but something feels off immediately. The city skyline is familiar, yet softened. Public broadcasts speak with unusual warmth. People walk with more open expressions. A strange, almost eerie calm overlays everything. The world seems gentler, that the traveler feels distant from it. The emotional cadence of the world no longer matches their own. Jokes feel too sincere, arguments too rare, expressions too earnest. The traveler was forged in a harder world, a colder one. Now they exist in a future shaped by kindness, but it no longer fits them. This emotional incompatibility is the cost of the ripple. While the world adapted over time to the growing waves of empathy, the traveler, untouched by the intervening emotional evolution, stands apart. They remember a version of reality where vulnerability was hidden and trust was earned slowly. Now, trust is given freely. Emotions flow easily. It is a better world by almost every measure, but the traveler feels alien in it. They know how to navigate systems of suspicion and silence. In this brighter world, those skills are obsolete. Their heart, tuned to survival, now hears a melody that feels foreign. At first, the traveler tries to adjust. They smile more. They soften their voice. But the connection never quite lands. Their emotional baseline is calibrated to an old rhythm. They speak with restraint, while others speak with ease. They joke with sarcasm, while others answer with sincerity. It's not hostility, it's misalignment. Like an instrument slightly out of tune with the orchestra around it, the traveler, once deeply human, begins to feel robotic, not because their feelings are gone, but because the world has moved past them. They visit places they once knew, schools, markets, parks, and see echoes of what used to be. But everything is tinged with a warmth that feels too curated, too gentle. They attend a public lecture where strangers hold hands during moments of silence. They read headlines that celebrate vulnerability instead of victory. The world is better, they know this, but it doesn't feel like home anymore. The ripple they created didn't just change others, it left them behind. And so they begin to retrace their steps. They search through archives, hoping to find some remnant of the world they knew. But the conflict, the coldness, the guarded nature of human connection, they've all faded. Even the art is different now. Gone are the songs filled with anguish and longing. Now the melodies are filled with resilience and community. The traveler wonders, did I erase something essential? Was pain part of what made us whole? This question haunts them. Not because they regret the kindness, but because they now see how emotionally alone they've become. No one understands the tension they carry in their shoulders. No one flinches at sudden sounds. No one doubts first, they hope. The traveler isn't broken, but they are misaligned. like a machine built for a previous version of software, outdated not in knowledge but in tone. Eventually, they try to return to the past, not to undo the kindness but to witness the moment again, to understand how something so small could create such vast emotional momentum. But when they arrive, the boy is no longer there. The moment seems to have shifted. Maybe someone else showed kindness first. Maybe the traveler's presence was never needed. Or maybe time, in adapting to the ripple, has shielded itself. The past no longer welcomes them. The ripple has looped in on itself, making the timeline incompatible not just emotionally, but causally. They try to connect with people in this new world, to find someone who also remembers a harsher time. But memories have softened, history has healed, trauma has dimmed. The pain that once united people, the shared understanding of hardship, has been replaced by empathy so thorough that suffering feels like folklore. The traveler begins to wonder if identity can survive in a world it no longer resonates with, if a soul, shaped by hardship, can thrive in a reality born from healing. The sympathy ripple teaches us something delicate and terrifying, that even the smallest emotional gesture can bloom into something vast, that kindness is not just healing, it is transformative. But transformation has a price, especially for the one who initiated it. The traveler wanted to make the world better, and they did. But in doing so, they became a ghost in the future, a remnant of emotional frequencies that no longer exist, a heart beating out of sync with the collective rhythm. In the end, they stopped trying to fit in, not out of bitterness, but out of peace. They realized their role was not to belong, but to ignite. Like a spark that lights a fire it will never warm itself by. They walk among people who laugh more easily, love more openly, and fear less deeply. Not because of a grand speech or a heroic act, but because once, long ago, someone sat beside a crying child and listened, and that listening changed everything. The traveler fades into history, not as a name, not as a legend, but as a tone, a subtle frequency embedded into the emotional fabric of humanity. Not everyone will feel it, but it's there. In the smile offered to a stranger, in the hand extended during conflict, in the silence held for someone's grief. A world slowly tuned toward empathy, all from a ripple too small to measure, but too deep to undo. And so the traveler walks forward, not to change the past again, but to witness the future as it now unfolds, a future built on something they gave freely, but now can no longer fully share. The paradox is not tragic, it is beautiful. And in its quiet, bittersweet symmetry, it whispers a truth we often forget, that kindness echoes farther than we ever see, and sometimes, changing the world means losing our place in it. The Conceptual Paradox. Time travel is often thought of as a physical act, a machine, a device, a wormhole ripped through the fabric of reality. But what if the more potent version of time travel isn't physical at all? What if it's an idea, passed from one mind to another, across generations, without anyone ever stepping through a portal? The Conceptual Paradox begins not with an experiment or a machine, but with a conversation softly spoken across centuries. A traveler, armed with knowledge of the future, returns to a distant past. They speak not to kings or warriors, but to thinkers, philosophers, poets, mathematicians. They plant a single seed, the concept of time travel, not the method, just the idea. And that is all it takes. The ancient minds are intrigued. The notion of moving through time like space, of jumping to the future or retreating into the past, excites something deep and primal. They begin to write about it, speculate, build myths around it. The idea spreads slowly, then steadily. It weaves into stories, art, and metaphysical debates. Over time, civilizations inherit the concept. They don't know where it came from. It feels old, ancient, even timeless. Generations pass, and the idea becomes embedded in human thought. Long before technology makes it plausible, people dream of it, write of it, believe in it. Centuries later, engineers and scientists begin constructing machines based on equations they believe they've derived on their own. But the origin, the true source, was always the traveler's whispered conversation in a time long gone. And here lies the paradox. The traveler only knew about time travel because it was part of the culture they were born into, a culture shaped by the thinkers of the past. But those thinkers only imagined it because of the traveler's visit. The idea has no starting point, it loops. It exists because it existed. It is a concept with no true origin. This is not a paradox of cause and effect in the traditional sense. It's subtler. It's not about a man killing his grandfather or sending blueprints to his younger self. It's about a concept, something non-physical, existing in a loop that never begins and never ends. The traveler, perhaps unknowingly, has created a thought that feeds itself through time. The idea exists without the act. Time travel becomes a cultural artifact, a symbol, a theoretical pursuit, but never a realized one. It is a dream that created itself. The conceptual paradox challenges our understanding of origin. We are used to tracing things back, to first causes, to sources. Every building has an architect, every story an author. But this idea has neither. It was not born in a single moment, it exists in all moments simultaneously. When the traveler shared it with the past, they did not create it, they merely continued it. And the past, in receiving it, made it possible for the future to believe it was their own. It's like a book that writes itself, with each page referring to the next, never revealing the first word. Imagine a civilization where the myth of time travel is deeply rooted. Children grow up hearing stories of chrononauts and distant futures. Scholars debate temporal mechanics long before they understand gravity. Engineers dedicate lifetimes to trying to build the impossible. All of this driven by an idea that feels foundational. But the more they search for its origin, the more elusive it becomes. It's always before the myths, before the stories, before the first philosophy. Like a shadow cast without a source. And no one questions it, because the concept feels inevitable, natural, but it isn't. It's a loop. The traveler, upon realizing this, begins to unravel internally. They believed they were sharing a piece of knowledge, perhaps even doing good, but now they see the recursive nature of what they've done. They didn't spark curiosity, they reinforced an illusion. The illusion of origin. The traveler becomes haunted by the question, if this idea has no beginning, is it even real? Can something exist purely through conceptual continuity? And if so, how many other ideas in human history are trapped in similar loops? Ideas that were never born, but simply passed. The paradox becomes more insidious over time. People begin devoting resources to achieving time travel. Scientists break their minds over equations that go nowhere. Funding is poured into research labs. The brightest minds chase the dream of stepping outside time, but it never materializes. Because the foundation isn't physical, it's conceptual. They are trying to build something that was never meant to be built, a dream sustained by its own echo. And still, it persists. Because belief, once seated, is hard to uproot. The world does not need time travel to be real for the concept to drive it forward. There's a strange elegance in it, a self-perpetuating idea, immune to scrutiny because of its age and depth, a thought that becomes religion, then science, then culture. It's harmless in one sense, but in another it consumes. People delay lives, abandon families, sacrifice everything to solve a puzzle that has no key, only a loop. And the traveler watches as society bends further around the concept they carried like a torch through history, not knowing they were only relighting a flame that had never gone out. Eventually, the traveler tries to correct it. They return again, hoping to undo the conversation, hoping to intercept the philosophers before the seed is planted, but it's too late. The idea exists in too many forms. It's in oral stories, symbols etched into stone, metaphors hidden in poetry. Even if the traveler remains silent, others repeat the myth. It has woven itself into language. It can no longer be traced. It's become a permanent fixture in the mental architecture of civilization. The traveler cannot erase it. They can only watch it evolve. The conceptual paradox reaches its peak when people finally realize the truth, that despite millennia of belief, time travel has never occurred. No one has ever left time, no machine has broken the barrier. And yet, the idea has survived, has thrived. People begin to study the phenomenon not as physics, but as philosophy. They ask, how can an idea survive without origin? And in this, they discover something more unsettling. Time travel is not the only one. Many of humanity's deepest beliefs may be conceptual loops. Myths sustained not by evidence, but by recurrence. In this light, the traveler becomes a kind of myth themselves, a symbol of how fragile the boundary between thought and reality truly is. They are no longer a person, but a placeholder in a story that cannot begin and does not end. A name occasionally whispered in theories, though no one remembers why. Even the traveler's own identity begins to dissolve. Were they ever real? Or were they just part of the loop? A thought inside another thought, dreaming of a journey that never happened. And maybe that's the final turn of the paradox, that the traveler never existed at all. That the story of the traveler was itself part of the myth, a narrative told by the philosophers to explain the concept, a backstory imagined to give the idea weight. And so, we return to the beginning, an idea born without cause, passed from voice to voice, shaping the world without ever touching it. No machine, no footsteps in ancient dust, just a whisper, just a word. The conceptual paradox is not meant to be solved. It is meant to be felt. It is the unease you feel when you try to trace the source of an idea and find only reflections. It is the silence behind every myth, the echo behind every truth. It reminds us that not all realities are built from atoms. Some are built from belief. And some beliefs are so strong, so enduring, they loop through time itself, without ever needing to be true. And so we end where we began, with a concept, a thought that shaped centuries, a dream that had no dreamer, a traveler who never traveled, a paradox with no edge to grasp, just a ripple in the current of time, forever circling itself. Chrono Ego Fragmentation. Time travel, in theory, is often viewed as a journey through external space, departing from one point in the timeline and arriving at another. But the deeper journey is always inward. You do not just take your body through time, you take your mind, your memories, your sense of identity. The paradox begins not in the fabric of space, but in the mind of the traveler. Chrono Ego Fragmentation is the slow, quiet shattering of the self. It begins the first time someone returns to their past and makes a change, no matter how small. From that moment, the version of reality they knew begins to diverge from the one they now inhabit, and with it, their sense of self begins to fracture. At first, the traveler doesn't notice the difference. A word said differently, a glance not returned, a moment of hesitation instead of certainty. It all seems so minor. But memories are delicate. A single change in the past reshapes the context of everything that follows. The friends they had, the moments that defined them, the losses that taught them resilience, all bend slightly under the weight of that change. And so, the person who steps forward through time is not the same as the one who stepped back. Their memories are outdated, their personality misaligned. The self they've brought with them no longer fits the world they now stand in. Imagine waking up in a room you've lived in for years. only to find the furniture slightly rearranged. The walls are the same, but the details are off. Now imagine your mind is that room. Your childhood feels familiar, but the events are subtly wrong. People recall things you don't. You remember tragedies others say never happened. Your deepest fears were shaped by events that never occurred here. This is the beginning of fragmentation. Your ego, once whole, begins to divide into layers, each attached to a version of reality that no longer exists. With each trip backward, the effect multiplies. Each change in the past births a new iteration of you. Close, but not quite the same. Maybe you prevented a heartbreak or pushed yourself to speak up when you once stayed quiet. These changes alter how others treat you. That treatment rewires your personality, your choices, your identity. You return to the future and find yourself surrounded by people who know a different version of you. They laugh at stories you don't recall, love you for reasons you don't understand, and distrust you for mistakes you never made. And in their eyes, you are both yourself and someone else. The fragmentation becomes emotional first. Disconnection, unease, a sense of being hollowed out. The traveler begins to doubt their own reactions. A song plays, and tears rise without memory. A scent triggers panic without reason. These are echoes from alternate versions of the self, memories formed in realities that no longer exist, but whose emotional signatures remain. The body carries the imprint of every timeline, and yet the mind cannot keep up. It clings to a version of self that has already been overwritten. Soon, psychological incompatibility sets in. The traveler begins to experience cognitive dissonance at an unbearable level. Thoughts feel borrowed, desires feel foreign, actions arise without motive. It's not psychosis, it's identity drift. Their brain contains overlapping blueprints of selfhood, each shaped by slightly different lives. One version of the traveler is ambitious, another cautious. One is bitter from betrayal, another is naive with hope. These selves begin to leak into each other, creating a chorus of contradictory instincts. The traveler speaks but doesn't recognize their own voice. They act but feel like a passenger in their own skin. This fragmentation isn't visible to the outside world. To others, the traveler seems slightly unstable, perhaps moody, erratic, distant. But inside, it feels like drowning. There is no solid ground, no fixed center. The sense of I am becomes a shifting landscape. The traveler tries to anchor themselves in memory, but the memories shift under scrutiny. Events rearrange. Emotional truths reverse. Faces blur. Even dreams feel like documentaries from someone else's life. They begin to fear sleep, not because of nightmares, but because of the identities that visit them there. Desperate to reclaim coherence, the traveler may try to go back again, to fix the fix, to undo what was undone. But each attempt only adds another layer of self, another strand of contradiction. The ego, once fragmented, does not reassemble. It multiplies. Like reflections in shattered glass, the traveler sees versions of themselves in every direction, but can no longer tell which is the real one. The paradox becomes self-sustaining. The more they try to repair themselves, the more selves they generate, each trying to correct a mistake the others made. Eventually, the body begins to rebel. It is not just the mind that holds identity, it is the nervous system, the hormonal patterns, the micro-responses coded over years of lived experience. But now those patterns clash. Muscle memory stutters, reactions misfire, hands tremble in peace and steady in fear. The traveler's own body no longer knows what reality it belongs to. It begins to reject the conflicting signals. Sleep becomes fractured. Hunger shifts. Even pain thresholds change. It's as if each fragment of ego is fighting for dominance, dragging the body with it. Relationships suffer most. The traveler can no longer connect fully with others. They forget shared moments, react with emotions that don't match the context. Friends pull away. Lovers grow confused. The traveler begins to isolate, not out of bitterness, but because they no longer know how to be consistent. They feel the weight of every version of themselves, some kind, some cruel, some wise, some lost, competing for expression. No one can relate, because no one else has touched so many pasts, carried so many selves. And then comes the final stage, disassociation from identity itself. The traveler stops referring to themselves in the first person. I becomes unstable. They speak in metaphors, in fragments. They keep journals, trying to trace back which memories belong to which version. They tape photos to walls, labeling each one with timelines that no longer exist, not because they're losing sanity, but because they're trying to find coherence in the chaos. They don't want to forget. They want to remember who they were before the splits began. Chrono Ego Fragmentation teaches a harsh truth about time travel, that identity is not portable. The self is not a fixed entity that can be carried intact across timelines. It is woven into the moment, into the history that shaped it. Alter that history, and you alter the self. And while the body can carry scars and memories, the soul, the part that says, "This is me," is fragile. It cannot survive infinite edits. Eventually, it becomes a patchwork, a quilt of contradictory lives, stitched together with fading thread. The traveler, now barely more than a shell, walks among others unnoticed. They wear a face that no longer means anything. They smile when they remember how. Their voice carries the tones of 100 timelines. Some days they feel the echoes of joy they never earned. Other days, the weight of guilt for sins they never committed. Their tragedy is not that they failed. It's that they succeeded. They changed their past. They shaped their destiny, and in doing so, they dismantled their own sense of self. In time, they stop traveling. Not because they're afraid, but because there's no self left to return to. They've fragmented so far from their origin that they no longer know what they were trying to change. The original pain, the original desire, it's all been overridden. Their only remaining truth is this: you can carry your body through time, but you cannot carry your soul unchanged. Every alteration leaves a mark, and too many marks become noise. Too much noise, and the music of identity is lost. And so, they fade quietly into the future they cannot recognize. They become a whisper in the records, a traveler known not for discovery, but for disappearance. Not in space, not in death, but in self. Lost not to time, but to the act of traveling through it. They are a warning now, a parable, a shadow behind every gleaming idea of time travel. The reminder that the deepest paradox is not in the world, but within the traveler. Chrono Ego Fragmentation is not a caution against invention, it is a meditation on memory, on identity, on the delicate balance between what we've lived and who we've become. It teaches us that we are not just made of choices, we are made of the order in which we made them. Change the order, and we change the soul. And once the soul is out of sync with the self, all that remains is a traveler walking through a world they once understood, holding a name that no longer fits, trying to remember why they ever wanted to change the past at all. The Echo Jail. There is a quiet horror in realizing that time remembers you, not with warmth or recognition, but with repetition. A traveler moves through time believing they are free, free to observe, to change, to return. But there is a trap waiting in the subtle mechanics of memory and recursion. It is not built with iron or glass, not formed with keys or doors. It is built with echoes. The Echo Jail is not a place you are sent. It is a place you build around yourself, one moment at a time, by repeating the past in ways that reality can no longer ignore. It begins innocently enough. A traveler visits a moment from their own history, a childhood memory, a conversation lost in regret, a single pivotal hour. They return, not to interfere, just to see. But as they watch, something happens. They find themselves drawn to that moment again, and again. Each time they visit, they see more, hear more, understand more. But with each visit, the past begins to notice, not in the way a person notices a sound, but in the way a room notices a shadow. A pattern begins to form. The air thickens. The moment becomes sensitive to presence. The traveler feels it first as a weight. The scene they once moved through easily now resists them. Their thoughts become slower, their observations dimmed. The moment, once fluid, grows stiff. It begins to repeat itself, not naturally but with strain. The people within it say the same words, but the cadence changes. A delay here, a pause there. It's as if the scene is trying to remember what it was supposed to be. The more the traveler returns, the less authentic the moment feels. It's no longer a memory, it's a copy of a copy. And with each return, the fidelity fades. At first, the traveler believes the problem is theirs. Fatigue, perhaps, the mental toll of looping through time. But the truth is stranger. They are not just revisiting the moment, they are imprinting it. Each visit leaves a residue, a psychic indentation. The moment, no longer stable, begins to exist in a state of flux, like a groove worn too deeply into a record. It plays the same tune, over and over, until the music itself becomes distorted. The people within the moment start to notice things they shouldn't. They glance toward where the traveler watches. They pause mid-sentence. They repeat a line, not out of habit, but out of obligation, as though the scene must now conform to the memory rather than unfold naturally. This is when the walls of the echo jail begin to form. Invisible at first, merely a sensation, a narrowing of time. The traveler attempts to leave the moment, but something pulls them back. A whisper in the corridor, a flicker in the machine. They step away, only to find themselves returned. The past is no longer a destination, it's a magnet, a trap. The more they try to escape it, the more it repeats. It isn't that the traveler is imprisoned by force. It is that the moment won't let go. It plays on a loop, drawing the traveler back into its cycle. Soon, the traveler begins to lose track of how many times they've visited. The moment feels like a dream now, real and unreal at once. They see versions of themselves watching from other corners. Shadows of past visits, a nod here, a movement there. They try to speak to these echoes, but the echoes do not speak back. They are not copies, they are recordings. Ghosts of presence, evidence of attention. The traveler, horrified, realizes that every return has created an echo. And now, those echoes are stacking. Like layers of transparent film, they distort the image beyond recognition. Time, it turns out, is not passive. It tolerates the traveler's presence once, maybe twice. But repetition erodes the integrity of the moment. Each visit corrupts the data, the scene degrades, the characters begin to break, eyes glaze, voices lose depth. Events play out too quickly or too slowly. Time is trying to eject the traveler, but there is nowhere for them to go. The traveler, by returning so often, has become embedded in the moment, not physically. Conceptually, they are now part of the memory's structure. They are the echo. As this realization dawns, the traveler tries a new tactic. They leap far into the future, hoping to reset, but the damage follows. In distant times, they see remnants of the echo. A child recites a phrase from the corrupted moment. A sculpture appears that resembles a character who should never have existed. Reality, once pristine, begins to show scars. The traveler learns that the echo jail is not confined to the past. It radiates outward. Each loop contaminates not just the original moment, but everything that stems from it. The jail expands, quietly, invisibly, across time. Worse still, the traveler begins to hear their own voice in strange places. not speaking, echoing, in the murmur of crowds, in static on old recordings, in dreams recounted by strangers. Their presence has become so deeply etched into time that it now bleeds into unrelated events. They have become a frequency trapped in the background noise of existence, and it begins to take a toll. The traveler finds it harder to think clearly. Their own memories start to loop. They recall scenes multiple times in different orders. They question whether they've done something or merely seen themselves doing it. Their consciousness begins to fracture under the pressure of repetition. The final stage of the echo jail is psychological. The traveler, once certain of who they were and when they belonged, now floats between selves. They wake in the middle of actions. They finish sentences they don't remember starting. They look in mirrors and see expressions they didn't choose. They are not possessed, they are overwritten. The echoes of their own presence now live independently, like threads running parallel to the self. Sometimes they hear these echoes whisper before they speak. Sometimes the echoes act first. Time has no interest in rescuing the traveler. It does not punish, but it does not forget. The traveler becomes an embedded loop, a recursive thought playing endlessly through the folds of history. And even if they try to return to the exact moment of their first journey, they find it has changed. It remembers too much. It expects them now. It cannot be experienced as it once was. It is grown dependent on the traveler's presence. It performs itself, anticipating the return, like a puppet repeating lines long after the audience has left. Eventually, the traveler ceases all attempts to escape, not out of resignation, but from a growing numbness. They become quiet observers of the echoes they've left behind, watching themselves watch themselves, unable to tell which version was the original. The echo jail is not a punishment for hubris. It is the natural consequence of recursion, of stepping into a loop too many times, of confusing presence. And so the traveler remains, neither alive nor dead, neither here nor then, just present, always present, a ripple that never fades, a voice caught in time's throat. Sometimes, in quiet moments, we hear them, in déjà vu, in repeated dreams, in memories that don't belong to us. That's the traveler, still echoing, still looping, still looking for the door that was never there. The echo jail reminds us that time is not only fragile, it is watchful. It does not forget who touches it, and it does not easily let go. So when we look back, when we reach for the past, we must do so gently, for the more we return to a moment, the more we risk becoming trapped within it, not by chains or walls, but by our own echoes. Endless, recursive, and inescapably familiar. Karma, Inversion, Paradox. Karma is the quiet accountant of existence. It is the unseen weight behind our choices, the whispered equation balancing intention and result. It tells us that good leads to good, that wrong invites its echo, and that somewhere in the weave of reality, fairness is not a myth, but a force. We act, we feel, we suffer, and we learn. But what happens when time itself is no longer linear? When a traveler moves backward, rearranging actions and unweaving causes and unraveling effects, that is when karma, too, becomes inverted, and what once was a moral compass becomes a spinning needle. Welcome to the Karma Inversion Paradox. It begins with the noblest of intentions. A traveler, weary from the burdens of their own mistakes, seeks to make amends, not in their present, but in the past. They return to moments they regret, choosing this time to act with compassion instead of anger, with honesty instead of fear. They help those they once hurt. They protect the ones they once ignored. They choose empathy where once there was indifference. In every way that matters, they become better, more mindful, more giving, and with each change they expect the future to improve, to brighten. But when they return to their own time, they find it colder. Strangers are less kind, opportunities are missed, friends seem distant, their health begins to decline. The more goodness they planted in the past, the more suffering seems to grow in their present. And the traveler, confused and heartbroken, begins to see the shape of the paradox. The karmic ledger is still balancing, but it's doing so back. The virtue they show in the past results in unexplained consequences in the future. It's not punishment, but it feels like one. A reversal. A shadow cast in the opposite direction. The karma inversion paradox arises not because karma has failed, but because causality has been bent. Karma, like gravity, functions across time, but when time is no longer a forward path, the logic of balance becomes distorted. When a traveler brings virtue into a moment where it never belonged, that virtue has no soil to root in. The surrounding context, shaped by pain or conflict, rejects it. And so reality redirects the energy elsewhere, to a moment still in motion, often to the traveler's own timeline, because that is the only thread still open. The result is ironic. The better the traveler becomes, the more the universe seeks to balance it, by shifting their suffering forward. And the traveler tries to understand. They study ancient texts, they revisit philosophies, they look for loopholes. But no doctrine accounts for retroactive morality. Karma, they learn, is not simply a tally of actions, it is a flow, a current. When they move upstream, doing good where harm once lived, they are not erasing pain, they are displacing it. That pain, now homeless, finds its way to them, not because they deserve it, but because they changed the map. Every act of kindness performed out of sequence creates a pressure somewhere else. Every correction creates a new imbalance. Eventually, the traveler tests this theory. They perform an act of selfishness in the past, a small one, a deliberate reversal. And in the present, something improves. A friend calls, a payment arrives. The air feels lighter, it's horrifying. The traveler recoils from the implication, but it is clear. The karma they left behind has followed the new thread. They are not being rewarded for cruelty. They are being corrected for the virtue that preceded it. The past, in its rewritten form, must now carry the burden of balance, and the paradox deepens. Worse still, the traveler begins to lose trust in their own motivations. Every act of goodness becomes suspect. If they help someone now, are they truly being kind? Or are they trying to manipulate the outcome of the future? If they sacrifice something in this moment, will it come back inverted later? Their moral compass, once so clear, begins to blur. They fear their own hands, their own heart, because intention, they realize, is no longer anchored. It floats between timelines, impossible to trace, and harder still to believe in. People around the traveler sense the change, not in action, but in energy. They see someone generous but guarded, present but distant. The traveler becomes emotionally split, one part trying to do good, the other anticipating the backlash. They smile while waiting for the sting, they give while preparing to lose. And this anticipatory sorrow begins to color their every decision. They live in a loop of preemptive regret. The karma inversion is no longer theoretical, it is psychological. Eventually, they consider doing nothing, stopping all time travel, letting the past rest, letting actions settle where they originally fell. But even that is a choice, and choices echo. The past has already been touched. The karmic current has already been diverted. There is no clean exit, no way to unwalk the steps. The paradox is now embedded in their story, and so they retreat from the world, not out of defeat, but in search of stillness. They begin to live simply, quietly. They stop trying to correct the past. They stop trying to optimize the future. they begin to act in the present, not for gain, but for grace. And slowly, the suffering softens, not because karma has realigned, but because the traveler no longer resists it. They allow the flow to pass through them. They mourn what is lost. They welcome what is offered. They stop assigning value to outcomes. They let go of the idea that good must be rewarded. And in doing so, they reclaim something deeper than justice. They reclaim peace. Not the peace of balance, but the peace of surrender. The karma inversion paradox is not a punishment. It is a lesson in humility. It shows us that we are not the authors of all consequence, that we cannot always trace the roots of reward or suffering. That time, when tampered with, turns morality into a hall of mirrors. Goodness remains good, but its echo is unpredictable. And perhaps, in that unpredictability, there is a deeper truth, that virtue must be lived without the promise of return. That kindness is real not when it is repaid, but when it is released freely without attachment. The traveler, in time, learns to forgive themselves, not for what they did, but for expecting control. They walk again among people, quieter, softer. They still act with care, but they no longer expect the universe to answer. They see pain not as punishment, but as part of the ripple. And in that space, something strange begins to happen. Their life no longer tilts violently. The swings of inversion fade. Karma, though still inverted in mechanics, no longer causes them suffering because they no longer measure their life by its logic. They have stepped outside the economy of reaction and into the calm of unconditional living. So, if you ever dream of traveling through time to right your wrongs or redeem your story, remember this: the universe may listen, but it will not play by the rules you know. It may echo your goodness in places you'll never see, and reflect your missteps in ways you never meant. The balance will always seek itself, but not always where you expect. And in that mystery lies both the danger and the beauty of time. The karma inversion paradox does not ask you to stop doing good. It asks you to do it without expecting a timeline to thank you. And maybe that's the deepest form of growth, to act with clarity, knowing that the ripple may return in disguise, to love, knowing the echo may come as loss, to forgive, even when time remembers you differently. Because in the end, the most powerful karma is not the one the universe enforces, but the one we choose, regardless of outcome. Quietly, gently, the language collapse paradox. Language is more than communication. It is the scaffolding of thought, the architecture of memory, the bridge between self and world. Through language, we don't just speak, we understand. We don't just describe reality, we construct it. Every word carries with it centuries of association, evolution, and meaning. So what happens when a traveler goes back in time and changes the roots of a language? Not by malice, not by accident, but through small, well-intentioned interactions. They introduce new terms, they simplify expressions, they shift metaphors to match their own time. It seems harmless, until the traveler returns and realizes they can no longer understand the world they once called home. This is the beginning of the language collapse paradox, a phenomenon where the smallest change to the past vocabulary leads to a complete dissolution of future language. The traveler had no idea that language, more than any invention, is the most sensitive thread in the tapestry of time. Every phrase spoken in the past echoes forward, subtly reshaping how people think, how they interpret emotion, how they define ideas. The change is not immediate, it is gradual. But over decades and centuries, the structure that held meaning together begins to bend. When the traveler returns to their own time, the world looks familiar, but it no longer sounds familiar. The words are different. Syntax has shifted. People use phrases they don't recognize. Idioms have no resonance. The traveler tries to read a book and finds it impenetrable. They attempt to watch a film and miss the emotional cues. Even facial expressions feel off, as if shaped by an emotional vocabulary they no longer share. It is as if their mind is out of phase with the culture around them, not physically displaced, but linguistically exiled. They seek help, hoping someone can explain the changes, but the explanations themselves use terms that are subtly alien. Every conversation feels like navigating a fog. The traveler can grasp the surface of meaning, but not the depth. Humor falls flat. Sarcasm is misread. Compassion sounds robotic. They begin to feel isolated, not because people are distant, but because understanding has become thin. Communication becomes mechanical, a series of empty exchanges without connection. And it dawns on them slowly, chillingly, that language has collapsed beneath them. The collapse is not a disappearance, it is a divergence. The traveler realizes that by changing key terms in the past, perhaps favoring simplicity, encouraging clarity, they removed complexity, they removed ambiguity. But ambiguity, it turns out, is where nuance lives, where poetry breathes, where emotion finds a voice. The culture that grew from their influence is one that values efficiency over expression, logic over metaphor, precision over passion. The words may still exist, but their souls have faded. They visit a museum, hoping to reconnect through history, but the placards read like instruction manuals. Art is labeled by function, music is categorized by frequency. The depth once found in literature, the layered meaning in old poems, is gone. People write, but they write only to convey, not to evoke. The traveler stares at a wall of text and feels nothing, because nothing was meant to be felt, only known. And in that knowing, the spirit of language has withered. The paradox intensifies when the traveler tries to write. They sit with pen and paper, or screen and keyboard, and find themselves paralyzed. The words come, but they do not arrive whole. They feel brittle. Their metaphors collapse on inspection. Their emotions cannot find form. The words they once used to understand themselves now betray them. They try to write about love, and it reads like a contract. They try to write about loss, and it sounds like a data report. Something inside has broken, not their mind, but their medium. And it becomes clear that language is not merely a tool, it is the vessel of memory. The traveler's own sense of identity begins to erode. They remember emotions but cannot articulate them. They recall dreams but cannot describe them. Their past becomes unreachable, not because it is forgotten, but because it is unspoken. Their inner world grows silent, not in peace, but in absence. And the traveler begins to fade, not from the world, but from themselves. They seek refuge in music, hoping melody might bypass the collapse. But even music has changed. Lyrics lack subtlety. Harmonies are clean but empty. The culture has turned away from ambiguity in all forms. What once hinted now declares. What once invited now informs. And the traveler, desperate to feel connected, begins to envy the silence, because at least silence holds space for the unsaid. In this new world, everything is said and nothing is understood. Eventually, the traveler discovers an underground circle, linguists, poets, and philosophers who sense the loss. They speak in fractured tongues, resurrecting forgotten dialects, preserving obsolete terms like relics. They don't resist the present, but they mourn it. They teach the traveler how to listen again, not to words but to rhythm, to pause, to tone. They share stories without conclusions, songs without lyrics. In these spaces, something flickers back to life, a ghost of the old language. Not complete, but enough. Through them, the traveler learns the final truth of the language collapse paradox. that language is not linear. It is not a straight line from past to present. It is a spiral, a living, breathing spiral that turns and returns, shaping and being shaped. Change one word and you change the arc. Remove a metaphor and you sever a feeling. Words are not neutral, they are emotional architecture. When you shift the foundation, the entire city leans. The traveler did not mean to dismantle the world, they only wanted to help it speak more clearly, but in doing so, they made it forget how to feel. They no longer seek to fix it. That urge has passed. They speak less, but when they do, they choose words like prayers, softly, carefully, with reverence. They know now that meaning cannot be engineered, it must be lived, shared, allowed. They write again, but not for an audience, not for impact. They write to remember the shape of thought, the curve of feeling, the strange, beautiful ambiguity of being. In time, the culture may heal, language may spiral again, it may regain its depth, its contradictions, its mysteries, but the traveler will always carry the ache of the collapse, the echo of a silence they accidentally summoned. They walk now among people who understand each other differently, people who speak in straight lines where once there were spirals, and though they smile and nod and reply, they will always live slightly apart, not in space, not in time, but in meaning. The language collapse paradox is not a warning against change. It is a reminder that words are sacred, that language is not just how we express ourselves, it is how we know who we are. To change it is to change the soul of a people. To simplify it is to narrow their emotional horizon. And once that horizon shrinks, so too does the depth of their dreams. So if you ever go back, if you ever find yourself in a moment where language is just beginning to take form, speak softly. Introduce nothing unless you are prepared to lose everything that once depended on the words you altered. And remember, the most powerful changes are not the ones that silence, but the ones that steal the subtle meanings between words. The quiet understandings, the unspoken truths, those are the ones that hold a culture together. In the end, the traveler becomes something of a poet again, not the poet of verse, but of attention. They listen more than they speak. They cherish silence. They teach others not to rush meaning. They pass down stories with broken endings and open questions. Not to confuse, but to awaken. Because only in the mystery of language can we remain fully human, and only in honoring that mystery can we prevent its collapse. Chronothermodynamic violation. Time, for most of us, moves only in one direction, forward, unstoppable, predictable. It marches with the steady rhythm of seconds and seasons, births and burials, and behind that motion lies one of the most sacred laws in physics, the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us that entropy, or disorder, always increases, that the universe, left to itself, drifts from order to chaos, that heat moves from hot to cold, never the reverse. But what happens when a traveler moves against the flow of time? When someone breaks the forward current and slips into the past, carrying information, matter, or intention from the future. This is where physics begins to fray. This is where the chronothermodynamic violation begins. It doesn't start with a bang. It starts with a breath. A traveler steps back in time, perhaps only moments, perhaps centuries. They carry with them a memory of what will come, or an object that belongs to a later era. At first, nothing seems wrong. The past accepts their presence quietly. But something has changed. A localized reversal has occurred. The traveler's arrival, subtle as it may be, decreases entropy. Information that should have been lost is now known. A process that should have taken years, development, decay, progression, has been circumvented. The timeline becomes more ordered, not by natural evolution but by interference. and that violates the thermodynamic direction of time. Entropy, after all, is not just a physical quantity. It is the arrow by which time defines itself. It is what makes the future different from the past. Without the constant increase of disorder, the flow of time loses its signature. When a traveler disrupts that increase, they don't just interfere with history, they interfere with time's identity. Suddenly, the past knows too much. It anticipates. It remembers. Systems evolve faster than they should. People make decisions based on knowledge that hasn't earned its place. The world becomes lopsided, accelerating in strange directions. The natural unfolding of complexity is cheated, and the laws that govern heat, decay, and flow begin to ripple. The first signs are almost invisible. Ice takes longer to melt. Clouds stall in the sky. Forests retain color beyond their season. Machines normally subject to wear resist breakdown. It's as though reality begins to hesitate, unsure whether it is supposed to fall apart or hold together. Entropy is no longer reliable. The natural push toward disorder has been slowed. And with that, the march of time begins to stagger. The traveler, unaware at first, continues their journey. They believe they are healing the past, improving the future, or correcting an error, but they carry the weight of order into a world built on slow unraveling. They write books too early. They invent machines before their time. They inspire minds who are not yet ready. And though each act feels like progress, it is, thermodynamically, a reversal, a decrease in entropy, a theft from the natural chaos of becoming. Over time, these interferences compound. The traveler notices that people begin behaving oddly, not out of fear, but out of synchronization. Their choices don't make sense. They hesitate in moments of certainty. They act with logic that lacks context. Society becomes slightly unstable, not due to external collapse, but internal confusion, because beneath the surface, the systems of the world are reacting to entropic imbalance. The weather shifts unpredictably, ecosystems falter, the stock market swings with ghostly precision. Reality, unanchored from its thermodynamic flow, becomes erratic. And then the deeper changes begin. Time itself responds, not in dramatic ruptures but in subtle distortions. Days feel uneven, sleep becomes unreliable, people experience déjà vu without cause, memory and expectation begin to blur. Time's arrow, once steady, begins to curve. The traveler finds themselves slipping, not just through moments, but through mental states. Their thoughts loop, their feelings repeat, their body grows colder, as if thermodynamic direction is being siphoned away. They realize they are no longer a visitor in the past. They are now an anchor of imbalance. They try to return to the future, but the machines resist. The energy required grows immense, because moving forward now requires restoring the entropy that was lost. But the system resists that restoration. It demands payment, equal and opposite. And the traveler begins to understand that time travel isn't just a spatial event, it is an entropic exchange. To go backward is to borrow order. To return is to repay it. But if the traveler has introduced too much knowledge, too much influence, the debt cannot be paid easily. The system pushes back. Now the traveler's presence begins to decay, not physically, but probabilistically. They become harder to track. People forget their face, photographs fade, recordings distort. The universe, struggling to restore its entropic balance, begins to erase the traveler's imprint. Reality seeks equilibrium, and that means undoing the low entropy ripple the traveler created. The paradox is cruel. The more good they tried to do, the more precisely they aimed to fix, the more entropy they stole. And now, the world reclaims it by unwinding their actions, their influence, and eventually their identity. They attempt one last journey, a return to the precise moment they first stepped through time, a hope that by undoing the act they can restore the flow. But the portal falters, energy systems collapse, not because of failure, but because the necessary disorder is missing. The randomness required for time to operate has been drained. The machine can no longer calculate uncertainty, and without uncertainty, time cannot flow. It stalls, it loops, it collapses inward. The traveler falls into a temporal echo, neither past nor future, just a recursive loop of events, each more precise than the last. They see versions of themselves repeating the same decisions, the same regrets. Entropy does not increase here. Nothing degrades, nothing dies, and because of that, nothing changes. It is a perfect prison, too ordered, too clean. A timeless stasis. The traveler screams, but the sound does not decay. It rings eternally, unaged. And then, something breaks. Not a machine, but a realization. The traveler understands that to restore time, they must reintroduce chaos, disorder, uncertainty. They must undo not their travel, but their precision. They must allow things to unfold imperfectly. To not guide, to not correct, they must become an agent of entropy, not destruction, but randomness. So they begin again, not by traveling through time, but by stepping into it and letting go. They stop shaping events, they start making mistakes. They allow uncertainty to return. And slowly, the world breathes. Systems resume their decay. Clouds drift again. Water flows. People speak in contradiction, in confusion, in beauty. Entropy rises. The timeline regains its rhythm. The traveler, still present, begins to fade, not into erasure, but into integration. They are no longer a foreign body in time's bloodstream. They are part of the pulse, no longer a node of unnatural order, just one unfolding thread in the chaotic tapestry. The chrono-thermodynamic violation teaches a deep truth, that time is not merely a dimension to explore, it is a balance to respect. Entropy is not our enemy. It is the music of motion, the drift that makes life possible. Without it, there is no growth, no death, no art, no memory, only stasis, only sterility. And though we long for control, for mastery over time, the cost of such control is steep. For every ounce of order we force, the universe demands a ripple of chaos elsewhere. In the end, the traveler becomes a teacher, not of time travel, but of entropy. They speak not of machines or moments, but of letting things unfold, of allowing mess, of trusting in the wisdom of imperfection. And those who listen begin to understand that time doesn't need to be controlled. It needs to be honored, not through precision, but through participation, not through correction, but through presence. So if you ever dream of walking through time, of fixing the past or perfecting the future, remember this: every step backward must be paid for in chaos. Every borrowed order must be returned with interest. The second law of thermodynamics is not just physics. It is a guardian. It protects time from becoming a prison of perfection. And in that beautiful, relentless unraveling, we find the only freedom that truly matters: the freedom to change, to decay, to become. The narrative paradox. We make sense of our lives through stories. From the moment we learn to speak, we string events into arcs, build meaning from moments, and wrap chaos in the language of beginning, middle, and end. The story becomes the structure, the skeleton that holds identity upright. It gives us purpose, frames our memories, and whispers to us who we are. But time travel complicates the story. It scrambles the sequence. It allows endings to precede beginnings, and inserts knowledge where ignorance once guided growth. The moment a traveler changes their past or glimpses their future, the arc breaks, and the narrative paradox begins. The paradox doesn't erupt all at once. It begins subtly, with a crack in coherence. The traveler, having returned from the future or altered the past, can still remember the old path, the original version of events, but the world around them follows the revised timeline. There is now a divergence between internal memory and external reality. Their life, once a single thread, becomes two competing stories occupying the same space. In one version, they failed. In another, they succeeded. In one, they were loved. In another, they were alone. The stories fight for dominance, and neither wins. The traveler carries both truths, but cannot reconcile them. And this fracture is more than confusion. It is an existential disorientation. Because we do not just remember the past, we rely on it to explain the present. The traveler wakes in a room that feels like theirs, but carries objects they never bought. Friends speak fondly of events the traveler has no recollection of. Journals contain entries written in their hand, but by a self they don't recognize. The narrative they once lived by, the story of how they became who they are, no longer fits. It is a garment that clings and slips at the same time. In this new life, the traveler may seem functional, even thriving, but internally the structure is hollow. The arc is incomplete. Because every story is built on cause and effect, and time travel breaks both. The causes are tangled, the effects uncertain. The traveler finds themselves acting without motive, feeling grief for losses that technically never happened, or missing people they never met in this version of reality. The emotional compass becomes unreliable. The self becomes a puzzle with no edge pieces. The paradox deepens with each intervention. The traveler, hoping to repair the narrative, might try to go back again, this time to fix the fix, to smooth the story. But each new change generates more versions, more stories, more selves. Now they do not carry two narratives, but 4, or 6, or 10, each one slightly different, each one insisting on its own truth. They begin to dream in conflicting timelines. In one dream, they hold a child they never had. In another, they are estranged from a parent who is, in this version, alive and well. These dreams are not fantasy, they are memories from roads not taken, lives once lived, now overwritten, but never erased. The mind, brilliant and fragile, starts to compensate. It begins stitching fragments of these stories together in desperate attempts to make sense. It combines endings with beginnings that never matched. It invents motivations where none existed. It fills the gaps with fiction. And for a while, this patchwork holds. The traveler finds a new rhythm, a new story. But deep down, they know it's a lie. Not because it's false, but because it's too clean, too linear. It ignores the weight of forgotten versions. It buries truths that still breathe in the quiet. Eventually, the traveler begins to lose track of which version they're in. Conversations feel rehearsed. Events unfold with eerie familiarity, as if predicted by a story they once read. They begin to speak in narrative terms, not what happened, but what should happen. This is the part where I leave, they might say, or this feels like a climax. The world becomes a script, and they are both author and character, unsure of who controls the pen. This is where the true heart of the narrative paradox is revealed, that by knowing too much, by seeing the threads before they're woven, the traveler is no longer living, they are editing. They try to craft the perfect version of their life, one where the pain made sense and the joy arrived on time. But stories resist perfection. They demand tension. Without uncertainty, the arc collapses. The traveler becomes bored, then numb. If they know how it ends, what's the point of the next page? They attempt one final rewrite, a last return to the moment before everything changed. But now, their presence distorts the scene. They anticipate too much. Their lines come too early. Their face betrays future knowledge. The moment, once fluid and alive, becomes stiff, forced. And then, like a book read too often, it begins to lose its magic. The people in it respond differently. The emotion fades. The story is exhausted. The traveler returns to their own time and sits in silence. Around them, life moves on. Children play, rain falls. Strangers pass with unknowable thoughts. But the traveler no longer feels part of it. They are a loop of narrative echoes, watching a world that no longer requires their authorship. And in this stillness, a quiet truth emerges. That the meaning of a story is not in its perfection, but in its surprise. That to live fully, one must not know what comes next. That purpose is born from the unknown. And so, the traveler lets go. They stop trying to fix the arc. They stop chasing the better version. They begin to listen instead, to moments as they are, not as they could be. They start writing again, but not to control, only to witness. They journal without editing. They speak without scripting. They allow life to be clumsy, inconsistent, beautifully unresolved. And in this surrender, a new story begins, one that they do not know, one that they do not own, but one that is finally real. The narrative paradox is not a warning against time travel. It is a reflection on meaning. It shows us that story is not something we impose, but something we discover. That trying to control the arc removes the very wonder we seek. That our lives are richest not when they are tidy, but when they are tangled and true. The paradox is not that stories break when time bends. The paradox is that we still try to write them, even when we know the ending. In the end, the traveler becomes less of a traveler and more of a presence. They walk through the world quietly, no longer needing to rewrite it. They nod at strangers, notice shadows, taste their food more slowly. They listen to stories told by others, not to fix, but to feel. They begin to value the chapters they cannot change, the mistakes, the silences, the questions without answers. And in that humility, they find something they never had before: peace. So if you ever find yourself longing to change your story, to go back and revise, to edit the heartbreak or fast forward the fear, remember the traveler. Remember that stories are not meant to be perfect. They are meant to be lived. And the ones that stay with us are not the ones we write ahead of time. They are the ones that surprise us, humble us, and leave us wondering long after the final page has turned. The dimensional guilt paradox. In a multiverse filled with infinite versions of ourselves, the boundaries between right and wrong become more fragile than we imagine. Every decision we make, every hesitation, every accident spawns another branch, another reality where we did not turn away, where we did not fail, where we did not survive. And within that infinite branching, there exists not just consequence, but conscience. A traveler who steps between dimensions begins to feel something strange. Not awe, not wonder, but guilt. Not for what they've done, but for what their other selves have done. Or worse, for what their other selves had to suffer so that this version could escape. This is the dimensional guilt paradox. It begins after the first few jumps. The traveler learns how to slide between alternate realities, slipping like a needle through the folds of possible worlds. At first it is exhilarating. They visit timelines where they are wealthier, healthier, wiser. They meet versions of themselves who made better choices, who loved more fully, who followed dreams that this traveler abandoned. It's a kind of therapy, confronting the ghost of potential and reconciling with the paths not taken. But soon the charm fades, because not all worlds are kind, and not all versions of the self are gentle. In one world, they find a version of themselves living in isolation, bitter and broken after a loss that never occurred in their own. In another, they meet a self who has committed atrocities in desperation or rage. They speak with versions who are unrecognizable, molded by violence, silence, or addiction. And as the traveler witnesses these fractured reflections, a quiet guilt begins to settle in. Because the traveler carries the privilege of perspective, they can leave, they can choose another version, but the selves they meet are trapped in the choices that made them. At first, the traveler tries to justify it. These versions are separate, autonomous. They are not them, not really. But the illusion of separation begins to crumble. They share the same face, the same memories up to a point. They share the same capacity for fear, for love, for failure. And the traveler begins to see them not as others, but as fragments. As pieces of one greater self scattered across possibility. The guilt is not about judgment. It is about connection and responsibility. The traveler begins to change. They move more carefully. They stop indulging in the thrill of the best-case timelines. Instead, they linger in the painful ones, offering help, sometimes just listening. But every act of compassion creates a deeper paradox, because by helping, they interfere, they alter that dimension's thread, they bring knowledge, resources, hope, and the moment they do, they become part of that reality. Their influence reshapes it. They are no longer just an observer. They are a cause. And for every life they improve, another version of the self suffers, because the balance between branches begins to tip. They realize that escaping guilt through action does not erase it. It multiplies it. Now they feel accountable not only for what they witness, but for the ripple effects of their interventions. They saved one version of their sibling in a universe where she had drowned, but in another, she now dies in a different way. Their presence has rearranged events unpredictably. It becomes a game of whack-a-mole with fate. Help here, hurt there, shift one reality, and another bends in response. Soon, the traveler begins to lose their grip on identity. They no longer know which version they began as. Was it the one who fled failure, the one who chased truth, or the one who simply wanted to escape pain? The faces of their alternate selves blend together. The guilt is no longer tied to a single event. It becomes existential. They begin to ask a question that has no answer. How can you atone for actions you never committed, but which could have been yours? Where does responsibility end in a web of infinite use? Their sleep becomes troubled. In dreams, they see themselves standing in vast halls filled with their own reflections, each one accusing, each one pleading. They hear voices asking, "Why did you get to leave?" and "Why didn't you stay?" They feel their heart pulled in 1,000 directions, each tied to a version of self that needs saving, forgiving, or simply understanding. And yet they cannot be everywhere. They cannot carry every burden. They begin to unravel, not because of what they've done, but because of what they've seen. The traveler starts to consider retreat. Maybe it is better not to look, to pick a timeline and stay, to close the door to the multiverse and live as if the others don't exist. But they know too much. They've seen the threads. They've seen the selves that didn't survive, and pretending ignorance now feels like betrayal. How can one version of a person enjoy peace knowing that peace was denied to countless others who share the same soul? This is the final twist of the dimensional guilt paradox. It is not about justice. It is not about consequence. It is about empathy, spread too thin across infinite mirrors. When you understand that every version of yourself has suffered in some world, you begin to grieve for yourself endlessly, not in vanity, but in mourning. And when you realize that every act of escape, every lucky turn, was paid for with the suffering of another possible you, you begin to wonder whether survival itself carries a cost. The traveler tries to make peace with it. They begin to document their journeys, to record the lessons of each version, not to change them, but to witness them. They create a journal that spans dimensions, filled with moments of humanity, kindness from broken versions, wisdom from cruel ones, beauty from lives marked by tragedy. They stop trying to fix the multiverse. Instead, they seek to honor it, to hold space for the pain and the power of what it means to be a self fractured by infinite possibilities. And slowly, something shifts. The guilt does not vanish. but it transforms. It becomes compassion. It becomes humility. The traveler no longer believes they are meant to save the others, nor to be saved by them. Instead, they become a witness, a bridge, a thread of presence weaving through the cloth of what might have been. They begin to understand that the point is not to avoid guilt, but to carry it wisely, to let it soften them, to let it deepen their sense of what it means to be human across all timelines. The dimensional guilt paradox is not a punishment, it is a realization that with infinite selves comes infinite responsibility, not to control, but to care, not to correct, but to connect. And in the quiet of this understanding, the traveler finds something like peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of surrender. They no longer ask which version is the real one. They no longer count how many lives were touched or how many were lost. They simply continue, one moment at a time, knowing that to be alive in one world is to be accountable to all. So if you ever dream of reaching across the dimensions, of meeting your other selves and fixing the broken pieces of your story, remember the traveler. Remember that with every door you open, another remains closed. That for every truth you uncover, another becomes harder to bear. And yet, the journey itself is not in vain. It is in the looking, in the listening, in the quiet, impossible grace of acknowledging the many versions of you who tried their best, failed often, and still mattered. Because in the end, the multiverse is not just a maze of probabilities, it is a mirror of empathy. And the self is not a single point, but a constellation, a collection of possible hearts beating together across every version of the truth. Reverse causality exhaustion. Causality is the quiet thread that holds our reality together. One thing leads to another. A spark creates fire. A decision becomes a destiny. From birth to death, cause and effect form the invisible scaffolding of existence. We build our lives on the assumption that time flows forward and that consequences come after choices. But in the realm of time travel, this assumption begins to unravel, and in its place comes a stranger truth. Reverse causality. Effects precede causes. Outcomes come before decisions. A traveler, caught in this strange sequence, begins to live backward in meaning while moving forward in time. And this, slowly, relentlessly, leads to what is known as reverse causality exhaustion. At first, the traveler doesn't notice anything unusual. They visit the past, change something small, and return to find the future altered. But as they repeat this process, something curious begins to emerge. They notice outcomes before they make the choices that should have produced them. A friend thanks them for advice they haven't yet given. A stranger avoids them as if they'd wronged them, though no wrong has been committed. The traveler's life becomes a puzzle with pieces placed out of sequence. They begin to see effects that demand causes they can no longer remember choosing. This experience is disorienting but manageable at first. The traveler simply fills in the gaps. They write the messages they were thanked for. They commit the actions they were accused of. They adapt their behavior to match the future already unfolding around them. But something inside them starts to crack. Because choice has lost its meaning. Intention has been replaced by obligation. They are no longer acting. They are following a script written by their own shadow. Every decision becomes a reaction to something that already happened, even though it has yet to be done. As the traveler moves through their timeline, exhaustion sets in, not of the body but of the will. They are tired in a way that rest cannot fix, because to live with reversed causality is to live without authorship. Imagine apologizing for something before you've hurt someone. Imagine mourning someone before they die. Imagine falling in love with the memory of a relationship you haven't yet begun. It erodes the soul. It hollows out the present moment. The traveler begins to feel like a ghost in their own life. Soon, their mind starts to resist. It begins to forget things preemptively. Conversations they are destined to have blur before they begin. Emotions become confused, layered in reverse. Joy is followed by uncertainty. Regret precedes action. The traveler becomes paranoid, questioning whether their feelings are truly theirs or simply echoes from a future already decided. They begin to question whether they even want the things they are walking toward, or if they are merely completing loops set in motion by past interference. They try to rebel, to act randomly, to say something unexpected, but the world adapts. The future reconfigures instantly. They find that no matter how they twist, the effect precedes them. The outcome reshapes their intention. And in this strange paradox, they begin to feel like a prisoner of inevitability. There is no space to choose, no room to surprise, no freedom to become, only the burden of fulfilling events that echo backward through time. The traveler retreats from others. They speak less. They stop trying to explain what they're feeling because words cannot contain the dissonance. How do you tell someone that you already regret what you haven't yet done? How do you ask for forgiveness for a moment that hasn't arrived? They begin to avoid relationships, knowing they will end before they start. They begin to fear kindness, knowing it may be repayment for future harm. Every interaction becomes a weight, a step further into exhaustion. As time moves forward, they notice another symptom, a numbness toward cause. They stop believing that effort matters. They stop investing in process, because the results always arrive before the work. They ace tests they didn't study for. They receive praise for projects they haven't begun. The world rewards them in reverse, and in doing so, strips the reward of meaning. Success becomes hollow. Achievement becomes theater. Life turns into a series of backwards victories, each more disconnected from effort than the last. Eventually, the traveler starts to deteriorate, not physically, but existentially. They begin to forget what agency feels like. They start to doubt whether they ever had control, whether free will was always just an illusion stretched across a timeline that only seemed to move forward. They feel like a puppet pulled by future strings, acting out choices they didn't make for reasons they can't feel. And in this fog of anti-intention, the self begins to blur. They sit in quiet rooms, watching the world go on around them. People speak, laugh, grieve in the right order. The traveler envies them, not for their outcomes, but for their causes, for their ability to believe that their choices still shape something, that tomorrow is not already written, that meaning can still grow from the soil of effort. The traveler, once curious and bold, now walks like someone carrying invisible chains. They are weary from the inside out. They attempt to stop traveling, to lock the machine, to sever the ties between past and future. But even this act has consequences that ripple backward. The world begins to forget them in strange ways. Documents alter themselves. People remember different names. Photos fade. It is as if causality, now bent too far, begins to erase the traveler to restore balance. And in that erasure, there is a strange mercy, a release. But the traveler holds on, not out of hope, but from the instinct to understand. They begin studying time not as a physicist, but as a philosopher. They meditate on what it means to live in reverse. They learn to feel pain without a source, to cherish joy without a cause. They begin to build a new kind of meaning, not from action and reaction, but from awareness, from presence, from acceptance. And slowly, something shifts. They stop trying to fight causality. They stop trying to write their own story. Instead, they begin to listen to the one already unfolding, not as authors, but as witnesses. They let each moment arrive, not as a test of control, but as a message from a future they no longer fear. They begin to move with time, even when its direction defies understanding. The reverse causality exhaustion never fully fades. It lives in the quiet corners of the traveler's mind. in the dreams that play backward, in the emotions that arrive too soon. But it no longer defines them. It no longer drains them. Because now, the traveler has learned a deeper rhythm, one that honors mystery, one that accepts dissonance, one that knows that sometimes we must live through the effect before we understand the cause. And so the traveler becomes a kind of sage, walking gently through the world, holding space for those who still believe in straight lines. They do not preach, they do not correct, they simply reflect. And in their eyes, people see a strange calm. The calm of someone who knows that time is not a highway, but a maze. That not all meaning comes from order, that some of the most profound truths arrive before we know how to ask for them. So, if you ever find yourself unraveling under the weight of things you don't yet understand, if you ever feel consequences rising before your choices, or sorrow arriving before the loss, remember the traveler. Remember that you are not broken. You are simply touching a deeper thread, one where the future leans in to meet you before you are ready. One where time moves like breath, forward, backward, and still. The paradox does not ask you to fix it, it only asks you to endure it with grace, to let the exhaustion speak, to let the confusion pass through you like weather, and to trust, even in the reverse, that your presence still matters, that your heart still echoes, that your story, however scrambled, still belongs to you. The probability collapse paradox. Probability is the gentle veil stretched over the unknown. It does not tell us what will happen, it tells us what might. It holds the universe in a delicate balance of uncertainty, possibility, and chance. We flip a coin and probability whispers that either outcome is valid. We make decisions and probability frames the range of consequences we may encounter. But at its heart, probability depends on ignorance. It needs us not to know. Because the moment we observe, the moment we measure, the wave of possibility collapses into certainty. Now imagine a traveler, one who learns to navigate probability, not just with statistics, but with presence. They begin to peek into outcomes that have not yet occurred, tilting the odds in their favor, bending randomness to their will. And with each act of foresight, the probability collapse paradox begins to unfold. It starts small, as these things always do. The traveler uses their knowledge to avoid an accident by choosing a different road. They make a strategic investment in a company before it rises. They pick the right words to change a relationship's course. To those around them, it looks like luck, or perhaps intuition. But the traveler knows better. They are drawing from a thread of probabilities they've already glimpsed. Not the future, but the weighted fog of possible futures. They aren't seeing outcomes, they're collapsing them. At first, it feels like a superpower, an advantage earned through intelligence and awareness. They begin to test it more boldly, not by manipulating people, but by maneuvering around consequences. They step into high-risk situations with quiet confidence, knowing the likely results. And indeed, things unfold in their favor. Choices begin to look less like gambles and more like inevitabilities. Randomness seems to retreat from them, like a tide pulling back. But probability, like all things in balance, resists control. And as the traveler begins to favor only the highest probabilities, only the outcomes with the best odds, they begin to thin the world around them. Possibility starts to shrink. Each time they collapse a probability wave early, the range of alternate paths gets narrower. Life becomes less surprising, less rich, less real. Friends begin to act in predictable pattern. Events unfold with an eerie symmetry. The universe begins to feel scripted, not because it is deterministic, but because the traveler has overused their influence. Soon the consequences intensify. The traveler notices that the improbable no longer happens. Coincidences vanish. Rare insights fade. Conversations no longer surprise them. Every event begins to feel like it was supposed to happen, Even their own emotions start to follow a track. Joy feels expected. Sadness feels hollow. It is not just the external world that has collapsed. It is the inner world of spontaneity, creativity, and meaning. The traveler has removed the unknown from their life. And in doing so, they've removed wonder. The paradox sharpens when the traveler attempts to reverse it. They try to embrace risk again, to welcome uncertainty, but probability has already reshaped itself around them. The future anticipates their foresight. Random events avoid them. Uncertainty, once a natural rhythm, becomes a rare and unreachable state. It's as though the universe has remembered too well. It no longer offers surprise because it no longer trusts the traveler not to interfere. The system, once playful, now obeys. And with that obedience comes collapse. Probability begins to flatten. The world offers fewer outcomes, fewer choices, fewer doors. The traveler starts to dream the same dreams, see the same faces, feel the same thoughts, looping like echoes in a well. They walk through a city that feels static, not still but resolved, as if everything that could have happened already has. The future becomes sterile, no forks, no turns, only a straight line forward into diminishing novelty. The traveler, once intoxicated with control, now feels starved for chaos. They miss the strange. They long for the unlikely. They yearn for the one-in-a-million encounter, the chance meeting, the impossible coincidence, but none come. Because the traveler has become a fixed point in the field of probability, their presence collapses waves before they form. They are too known, too calculated, too heavy with certainty. Eventually, they begin to withdraw, not from the world, but from decision. They stop choosing paths because they no longer believe in variation. Their actions feel performative, not generative. They eat the same meals, speak the same words, relive the same patterns, not out of habit, but out of inevitability. Life becomes a loop without freshness, not because the world is small, but because they have made it so. The final phase of the probability collapse paradox is existential. The traveler begins to question whether anything they do matters. If the range of outcomes is so narrow, is there any meaning in motion? If surprise is gone, can joy survive? They begin to understand that probability is not just a mathematical concept, it is emotional oxygen. Without possibility, hope has no room to breathe. Without risk, love has no depth. Without uncertainty, life has no color. The traveler seeks counsel. They speak with philosophers, with scientists, with strangers who live simple lives untouched by prediction. They try to relearn the art of not knowing. They seek ways to become unpredictable again. They let go of patterns. They embrace randomness. They refuse to make plans. But still, the universe hesitates. It does not trust them yet. Their presence still carries the weight of collapsed futures. And then, one day, the traveler does something different. They make a decision they know is wrong, not reckless, not cruel, but wrong. They choose the less efficient path, the option with the worst odds, the action that makes no sense. They do it not for attention, not to test the system, but to fracture the pattern, to shatter their own predictability. And in that moment, something opens, a crack in the pattern, a flicker of uncertainty, a breath of fresh probability. They begin to live that way, not erratically, but curiously, not predicting the future, but asking it questions, not collapsing possibility, but nurturing it. They start conversations they don't control. They follow instincts they don't understand. They welcome the unlikely and forgive the imperfect. And slowly, the world begins to respond. Chance returns. The improbable reappears. Coincidences become real again, and in those moments the traveler smiles, not with triumph, but with relief. The probability collapse paradox teaches a subtle truth, that control is not the same as freedom, that knowledge is not the same as meaning, that the more we try to lock down the future, the more we lose what makes it worth living. Probability is not a barrier to certainty, it is a partner in creativity. It is what allows life to surprise us, to move us, to wake us. And when we erase it, we erase our capacity to wonder. So if you ever long to know too much, if you ever wish to live a life where every outcome is known, every decision is perfect, every mistake prevented, remember the traveler. Remember the silence that comes when chance is gone. Remember the ache of predictability. And know that what makes life beautiful is not that we can shape it with certainty, but that we can walk into it with open eyes and no guarantee. In the end, the traveler is no longer a master of probability. They are a student of mystery. They make choices with care, but not with control. They listen to randomness as if it were music. They follow paths that make no sense and trust that sense will follow. And in that humility, in that surrender, the world begins to shimmer again. Because life, like a dice roll, was never meant to be precise. It was meant to surprise us, to challenge us, to open doors we didn't know we could walk through. And when we collapse too many probabilities too early, we lose not just the future, but the miracle of becoming. Tachyon Addiction. There are particles that dance backward through time. Theorized, elusive, faster than light. They're called tachyons, hypothetical carriers of temporal inversion. In the world of physics, they are mathematical curiosities, fleeting symbols on whiteboards, and dreams and equations. But in the realm of time travel, in the spaces where chronology bends and collapses, they become something more. They become a temptation, because tachyons don't just defy the rules of causality, they unravel them. And for a certain kind of traveler, that unraveling becomes an obsession, a sensation, a drug. This is where the tachyon addiction begins. At first, the traveler only brushes against the field. Exposure is incidental, a byproduct of experimental machinery or an unintended side effect of moving faster than causality can track. They feel it as a shiver in the bones, a lightness in the skull. Memories surface that don't belong. Thoughts appear fully formed from events that haven't yet occurred. It's disorienting, yes, but not unpleasant. In fact, it's intoxicating, like standing at the edge of the future and tasting it before it ripens. Time stops flowing in a line. It becomes a storm of moments, all whispering at once. They return to the field, not for research this time, but for sensation. The machine hums. Tachyons bloom like invisible flowers, and the traveler is awash again in the strange high of unearned knowledge. Their body remains in the present, but their mind stretches outward, sipping from tomorrows, folding yesterdays into the now. They see a conversation before it happens. They feel the outcome of a choice still unmade, and in this feedback loop of foresight, something inside them shifts. The hunger begins. Soon, the traveler can't function without the field. Without tachyons brushing against their neural rhythms, the world feels flat, dead. Time drags like wet cloth. Every second is too slow. Every cause is detached from its effect. In the presence of tachyons, existence is alive with possibility. Outside the field, life is burdened by sequence. The traveler starts seeking exposure in secret. More power, longer pulses. They tell themselves it's for calibration, for science, for testing, but it's not. It's need. The addiction grows quietly. At first, no one notices. The traveler seems sharper than ever, insightful, predictive. They make decisions with uncanny precision. They speak in strange metaphors and move with eerie timing. Colleagues admire them. The world believes they're a genius touched by luck or vision. But the truth is darker. They are not making decisions. They are replaying them. They have already lived these outcomes 100 times, backwards and forwards, through the haze of tachyon feedback. Eventually, the side effects begin. Memory distortion, Emotional flattening, relationships decay, friends speak of disconnection, of unpredictability. The traveler begins to forget what they've already said and what they only thought. Their sentences carry the weight of days that haven't happened yet. They respond to feelings not yet expressed. They apologize for injuries they haven't caused. The present becomes smeared, blurry. It can no longer hold them. Only the field feels real. Only the tachyons keep their mind from fracturing entirely. The paradox emerges slowly. The more tachyons they absorb, the less they can function in linear time. Meals are skipped. Sleep becomes impossible. Dreams are replaced by fractured timelines, each replayed endlessly through their skull. They cannot hold a conversation without jumping to its conclusion. They cannot make love without feeling the aftermath first. Pleasure arrives hollow, pain arrives early. The temporal order is inverted, and their soul is caught between fragments. They try to stop. They try to wean themselves off the field, but the withdrawal is unbearable. It's not just the absence of stimulation, it's the reintroduction of time's weight. Suddenly, every moment is too slow. Every decision is a burden. Waiting becomes torture. Uncertainty feels like suffocation. They panic in silence. They claw at their own mind, desperate to speed it up. And so, they return to the machine. Even a flicker of exposure brings clarity, a rush of meaning. The chaos becomes poetry again. But it's killing them. Their health begins to decline. Physically, the body weakens. The brain struggles to reconcile past, present, and future. Emotionally, they become unmoored. Every feeling is a composite of 1,000 timelines. Grief bleeds into joy. Anger arrives tinged with relief. They can no longer tell which version of reality they are in. They walk through the world half ghost, half god. They know too much and understand too little. They speak to people who do not remember them. They remember events no one else lived. They have become a chorus of selves, trapped in one decaying frame. Eventually, the institution takes notice. The research halts. The machine is locked. The traveler is grounded. They are placed under observation, monitored for psychological collapse. But what their caretakers fail to grasp is that the collapse has already happened. The traveler is no longer bound to a single self. They have lived too many futures, avoided too many pasts. They see time now not as a river, but as a web, a living, breathing lattice of maybe and almost and never. And they are lost within it. In the silence of confinement, they begin to write. Not in journals, but in fragments, sentences out of sequence, pages that loop, thoughts that contradict and complete each other. They try to capture what it feels like to live inside probability, to inhale the future, to know too much of what might be. But the words fail. Because language is built on time, grammar requires sequence. And the traveler no longer believes in order. Their syntax becomes a ruin, a monument to a mind that moved too fast. They plead for another moment in the field, just one pulse, just enough to stabilize. But they are denied. The scientists fear further exposure. They do not understand that the traveler is no longer withdrawing from tachyons, they are unraveling without them. The addiction is no longer about pleasure. It is about structure. It is about survival. The traveler is like a being who breathed fire and is now drowning in air. They were never meant to return to this slow, static world. Time begins to break for them entirely. Days repeat. Hours vanish. They see people age between blinks. They feel events rewind around them. It's unclear whether these glitches are real or just symptoms of their shattered perception. But it no longer matters. The traveler lives in echoes now, in patterns that no longer require the present. They speak to themselves, sometimes out loud, sometimes not, rehearsing dialogues that have yet to unfold. They are not insane, they are simply unstuck. And in this unsticking, something beautiful emerges, a kind of surrender. They stop fighting to rejoin time. They stop struggling to explain themselves. They begin to observe, gently, lovingly. They watch the rain with reverence. They feel conversations like music. They stop needing the tachyons, not because the hunger has passed, but because they have found a way to exist in the spaces between cause and effect. They have become a witness, a whisper at the edge of sequence. They are not cured, they are not healed, but they are calm. And in this calm, they begin to teach, not directly, but through presence. Others begin to sit with them, not to fix them, but to feel with them. They become a kind of oracle, not of prophecy, but of perspective. They speak in riddles that sometimes make sense days later. They smile at strangers who haven't met them yet. They cry for endings that haven't happened, and somehow it helps. The Tachyon Addiction is not about power, it is about surrender. It shows us what happens when we taste too much of what should remain unknown, when we stretch our minds beyond what time can hold. It is a caution not against science, but against certainty, because time, in all its slowness, is sacred. It is the space in which we grow, where we change, where we make mistakes and learn from them. To bypass that process is to become untethered. To live in the future is to lose the meaning of the present. In the end, the traveler remains in the facility, but they are no longer trapped. They sit by the window and speak to the wind. Some days they are lucid, some days lost, but always they are still, not because they've been silenced, but because they've seen too much to rush again. Their eyes hold 1,000 timelines, and yet they focus gently on whatever is before them. A leaf, a shadow, a smile. So if you ever find yourself longing to know what comes next, if you hunger for the future so deeply that the present becomes unbearable, remember the traveler. Remember that knowing too much can become a prison, that seeing the destination too early can erase the journey, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is live the moment slowly, with no answer yet in sight, because the real miracle is not in knowing, it is in not knowing. It is in discovering and in learning how to breathe in time without needing to outrun it. The Foreknowledge Curse. There is a comfort in not knowing, a warmth in the mystery of tomorrow. When we wake each day, we step into the unknown, guided only by hope and instinct. And while uncertainty can feel frightening, it also carries beauty. It makes choice meaningful. It gives life its flavor. But when foreknowledge enters the mind, when the future becomes fixed, seen, known before it happens, something vital begins to unravel. What once shimmered with possibility becomes heavy with inevitability. And this is the heart of the Foreknowledge Curse. It starts as a gift, as all curses do. The traveler sees something, perhaps a brief glimpse, perhaps a complete sequence of what will come. A decision made next week, a betrayal months away, a tragedy years down the line. And at first it feels like power, a way to prepare, a way to protect. With foreknowledge, there are no surprises. Every turn of fate is mapped, every loss is anticipated. But with every glimpse forward, a piece of the present begins to dim. The traveler becomes careful, deliberate. They speak with precision, avoid triggers, shape their words to align with a thread they've already seen. They tell themselves, this is wisdom, this is foresight. But the truth is darker. They are performing life, not living it. Their laughter is measured because they already know when joy ends. Their arguments are hollow because they already know the outcome. The world becomes a theater, and they are the only one who knows the script. Soon, the joy of anticipation fades. They stop looking forward to holidays, reunions, even love, because when the ending is already written, the middle loses its spark. Gifts feel empty when you know what's inside the box. Adventures feel dull when you've walked them in your mind 1,000 times before they unfold. The traveler begins to lose their appetite for experience, not because the world is any less vibrant, but because their knowledge drains it of surprise. They try to use this knowledge to help others. They warn a friend not to take a certain flight. They offer advice that seems too specific to be instinct. They prevent accidents, delay arguments. But each time they intervene, they feel further from the people they love. Because no one understands what they know. No one sees what they see. Every act of protection becomes another secret. Every success, another distance. And it begins to change how people see them. Friends notice the way the traveler watches, always just a second too soon. How they know things they shouldn't, how they react before something happens. Some admire it, others grow uneasy. Slowly, the traveler becomes isolated, not by rejection, but by strangeness. They are no longer living in the same temporal flow as those around them. They exist one beat ahead, like a song played slightly before the rest of the orchestra. Then comes the moment they dread most, the event they cannot change, a death they've foreseen, a heartbreak they've tried to delay, a mistake they couldn't stop. And it arrives, just as they saw. Not because they didn't try, but because the trying was part of what made it real. And in that moment, the full weight of the curse settles on them, because to know the future is not to control it. It is to carry it, silently, helplessly, while pretending you still have a choice. The traveler begins to withdraw. They stop sharing what they know. They stop trying to prevent what they've seen. Not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. Because with every act of foreknowledge, they are forced to play God without the power of divinity. They see the storm coming, but they cannot stop the rain. They know the words that will break a heart, but they cannot unspeak them. They begin to live in silence, not just to protect others, but to protect themselves from the burden of knowing. And yet, the visions don't stop. They come uninvited now. While the traveler sleeps, while they walk, while they breathe, they see versions of the future not yet fixed, fragments of moments that may or may not come, and that ambiguity becomes a second curse. Because not knowing whether a tragedy will unfold is worse than seeing it clearly. It breeds anxiety. Should they act? Should they wait? Is this the future or just a cruel illusion? The traveler tries to ignore it, to live as though they are blind again. But they can't. Because the knowledge is there, whether they use it or not. And in its presence, every choice becomes a trap. If they act, they shape the future. If they don't, they betray what they know. Free will becomes a maze with mirrors at every turn. And the traveler, once confident and curious, becomes hesitant, paralyzed, because every step feels predetermined, no matter how carefully they walk. In time, they begin to envy those who live without foresight, the people who laugh at surprises, who cry without knowing if they'll be comforted, who leap into love without weighing every outcome. They envy the uncertainty that once scared them, because it was never a weakness. It was freedom, the freedom to be present, to feel fully, to not carry the weight of what hasn't happened yet. The final stage of the curse is resignation. The traveler no longer tries to change the future, no longer clings to control. They begin to accept the flow of events, not because they agree with them, but because resistance has hollowed them out. They become quiet, observant. They still know, still see, but they let the moments unfold without intervention. They do not smile more, but their sadness is softer. They do not speak often, but when they do, their words are gentle. People begin to trust them again, not as a prophet, but as a companion. Someone who sees without judgment, who hears without needing to change the outcome. The traveler becomes a kind of guide, not one who alters paths, but one who walks beside others through storms they themselves have already felt. And in this new role, they find a strange peace, not in foreknowledge, but in presence. Because they begin to learn something new. That even when you know the ending, the story still matters. That even when the future is written, the way you show up in it changes everything. That love is still real, even when it ends. That pain is still meaningful, even when expected. That presence is more powerful than prediction. And in that quiet surrender, the curse begins to loosen its grip. The traveler still sees, the visions never stop, but they no longer crave certainty. They let the knowledge pass through them like wind through open hands. They stop hoarding insight and start cultivating wonder again. They learn to ask not what will happen, but who will I be when it does? And in that question lies the one freedom that foreknowledge cannot take away. The foreknowledge curse is not about knowing the future, it's about forgetting how to be here. It is a story of control that turns into surrender, of burden that becomes wisdom. It teaches that mystery is not a flaw in the universe, but its most sacred feature. That not knowing is not ignorance, but grace. So if you ever find yourself wishing to know what's ahead, to skip the questions and see the answers, remember the traveler. Remember the silence that comes when all is seen. Remember the hollow certainty that replaces the beating heart of life. And instead, choose wonder. Choose risk. Choose the trembling hand reaching into the unknown. Because the future is not a test to be passed, it is a landscape to be lived. And even when we know how the story ends, the beauty is still in how we tell it. Word by word, step by step, moment by unpredictable moment. Syntax of Reality Paradox. We live inside a structure we barely comprehend, not just space and time, not just matter and motion, but language, the syntax of thought, the grammar of perception, the unspoken rules that shape what is real. Everything we experience must be named to be known, framed in order to be shared. We think in words, we describe in sequences. Our minds rely on a deep structure of symbols and logic to make sense of the world. But what happens if you change the structure? What if someone finds a way to rewrite the syntax of reality itself? Not the words we speak, but the code beneath perception. That is where the syntax of reality paradox begins. It starts with a theory, a linguist working with physicists, a whisper shared in a small academic corner of the world. The idea that language doesn't just describe reality, it participates in it. That the grammar of consciousness influences the behavior of the universe. That there is a structure beneath everything, a deep syntax that governs how cause links to effect, how space curves, how matter forms. Not unlike the source code of a program, but vastly more complex. And within this code, certain patterns act like rules, deterministic when followed, chaotic when broken. A traveler, more researcher than explorer, becomes fascinated. They begin experimenting with symbolic representations that align with this underlying syntax, not in speech, but in structure, in visual logic, in encoded intention. They begin to construct expressions that feel strange at first, abstract and nonsensical, but soon begin to yield strange results, a shift in probability, a delay in cause, an object behaving slightly differently after being named in a particular sequence. It is not magic, it is not manipulation, it is communication. The universe, they realize, is responding to syntactic patterns not yet understood. What starts as an experiment becomes obsession. The traveler builds more complex forms, layering meaning over meaning, using intent and syntax in tandem. They speak not with sound, but with structure. And the world begins to shift. A glass shatters before it falls. A decision is made, and its consequences echo backward. The syntax, the deep, invisible logic of reality, has been bent. Not by force, but by fluency. They are no longer using language to describe the world. They are writing the world into existence. At first, the traveler believes this to be power, the ability to refine reality, to smooth edges, to alter what was assumed to be fixed. But soon, contradictions emerge. They make a change, a harmless one, and everything around them reorders to match. A friend forgets something they once held dear, a city map shifts by a street, time bends slightly and no one notices. Only the traveler remembers the original configuration, only they feel the dissonance. They try to undo the alteration, but the original structure is lost. The new syntax has overwritten it, like a corrupted file that still opens, but no longer makes sense. The traveler writes again, hoping to restore what was, but reality responds not with repair, but with resistance. Every new statement, every new syntactic form, further destabilizes the world around them. Objects lose their function. People speak in sentences that almost make sense. The air feels scripted, rehearsed, like reality itself is trying to remember its next line. The traveler becomes cautious, then frightened. They realize that each time they alter the syntax, they're not just changing events, they're rewriting the rules of perception. They are shifting how the universe understands itself, and in doing so, they are unraveling the shared grammar that holds experience together. Their mind begins to fragment. They see words behind objects, syntax behind smiles. They walk through sentences instead of streets. They listen to moments not in sound, but in logical structure. The world is still there, but no longer human. Soon, they can no longer speak to others, not because they've lost their voice, but because their thoughts no longer fit the shared grammar of conversation. They form meaning differently now, through variables, conditions, recursive loops of sense. When they speak, their words echo with strange weight, warping perception, unsettling listeners. Their presence distorts narrative. Their sentences don't end, they unfold. People begin to avoid them. Animals shy away. Even machines misread their presence. Syntax has become a force field, and the traveler is trapped inside it. They stop writing altogether, fearing further collapse. But the changes do not stop. Once begun, the shift continues. Reality adapts to the altered rules. The traveler realizes, with growing dread, that the deeper syntax is self-correcting, not to a previous state, but to a new equilibrium. The universe is rewriting itself to match the linguistic patterns they introduced, and those patterns are recursive. Each layer of change references the previous one, building upon itself. The fabric of reality is becoming a loop of self-referential structure. Time begins to collapse inward. Events echo, sentences repeat. Days feel like revisions of a rough draft. People begin speaking in mirrored logic. "I remember forgetting," someone says, and it feels accurate. "We were always going to never be here." The traveler recognizes the structure. It's one they wrote, not directly, but by implication. By bending the code beneath the world, they've created a feedback loop of meaning, a universe that no longer describes itself in human terms. They try to escape, to leave the area, the continent, even the planet. But the syntax follows. It's not geographical, it's embedded now in their presence. Their consciousness has been rewritten. Their neural pathways reflect the altered structure. They think in recursion. They dream in logic. Wherever they go, the grammar of the world bends slightly, adjusting to their frame of reference. They are a contagion of structure, a walking source code that rewrites everything they touch. The traveler isolates themselves, deep underground, into silence, into stillness. They refuse to form patterns, refuse to think in structure. They meditate, dissolve intention, try to unlearn the rules they've crafted. They hope that by stilling their mind, the recursive loop will break, that the syntax will quiet, that reality will stabilize. And for a time, it seems to work. The world stops shifting, people speak normally again. Cause and effect return to order. The sun rises when it should. But the traveler knows the truth. They haven't fixed anything. They've only paused the process. The syntax of reality is still watching, still waiting. It has tasted change. It has learned to adapt. And now, it carries a seed of recursion in every moment. Every event is slightly more self-aware. Every sentence carries a ghost of its own logic. The world has become a script, aware that it is being read, and the traveler can feel it, like a murmur behind sound, like a reflection inside every thought. The syntax of reality paradox is not about breaking the world. It is about rewriting the assumptions that make the world make sense. It is a lesson in humility that our perception is not passive, that the words we use, the patterns we form, the thoughts we repeat, all shape the lens through which existence flows. And when we tamper too deeply with that lens, we do not just alter what we see, we alter what can be seen. In the end, the traveler remains silent. They live as a shadow, careful not to form too much meaning. They walk through the world like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. They do not teach, they do not warn, because to name the paradox is to trigger it again. They simply exist quietly, holding their syntax close, watching the structure settle into something slightly new, slightly strange, slightly awake. And so, if you ever begin to notice strange echoes in conversation, if the world feels like it is speaking to itself, if the air feels scripted, if time repeats not in event but in phrasing, remember the traveler. Remember that reality has a grammar, that consciousness has a code, and that the more fluently we try to speak it, the more likely we are to be heard by something listening from beneath. Because the deepest truths do not live in facts, they live in form, in the shape of meaning, in the syntax behind sensation. And some paradoxes are not about what you know, but about how you say it. Phantom memory paradox. Memory is the quiet architect of identity. It stitches our past into a coherent thread, giving shape to the present and coloring the path ahead. Without memory, we would float, ungrounded, unformed. We define ourselves not just by who we are, but by who we remember being. But what happens when memory arrives without origin? When you recall a moment that never occurred, with emotions you never earned, in places you've never seen? What happens when your mind insists something is real that history denies? This is where the phantom memory paradox begins. It starts with a flicker, a sensation of déjà vu stronger than usual, rooted not in vague familiarity, but in vivid, specific detail. The traveler pauses mid-step, heart jolted by the sudden flood of recollection. A child's laughter in a place they've never visited, the weight of a ring they never wore, a farewell whispered to someone they've never met. The memory feels real, sharp, emotional, but it doesn't belong. They search their journals, old photos, conversations. No trace. The world insists it never happened, but their heart insists it did. At first, they dismiss it as imagination. The mind is known to fill gaps, to fabricate coherence where none exists. But the memories keep coming. Whole moments, dreams that bleed into daylight, a name whispered in sleep, the smell of a city that shouldn't exist. They remember a conversation with their mother that she swears never happened. They recall the death of a friend who is still alive. The line between memory and invention begins to blur. The traveler consults professionals, neurologists, therapists, scientists. They scan their brain, search for tumors, dissociation, false memory syndromes. The tests come back clean, but the memories persist, and they are not random, they are consistent, repeating, specific, carved into the fabric of the traveler's self like scars from an invisible war. They begin to question not their sanity, but their chronology. Maybe these memories are real, but from another version of themselves. Another timeline. Another strand of reality that no longer exists but still echoes inside them. The theory grows quietly in their mind. Perhaps time is not a clean stream, but a river of braids. Timelines splitting, merging, collapsing. And perhaps, during some temporal event, an experiment, a near-death experience, a dream too vivid to be just fiction, they crossed into a different thread. One that looked like their own, but was not. And in returning, they brought the ghosts of a past that never happened here. Their memories are not wrong, they are displaced. But this realization does not bring peace, it brings grief. Because the memories carry weight. They are not passive recollections. They feel lived. They carry love, loss, growth, guilt. And yet the people around them do not remember. Events they mourn are met with confusion. Relationships they cherish are one-sided. The traveler walks through a world that looks familiar but lacks the emotional mirror of shared experience. They are haunted not by what was, but by what was and now isn't. This leads to isolation, not physical, but emotional. They begin to guard their words, their reactions. They smile at strangers who were friends in the other thread. They hesitate when familiar music plays, unsure whether the tears it stirs are appropriate. They begin to split, one part playing the role expected in this reality, the other quietly grieving a different life, and no one sees it. Because memory, unlike fact, cannot be proven, it can only be felt. They try to document it, to write down every phantom memory, every detail, every impression, hoping for a pattern, a map. But the more they record, the more fragmented it becomes. Some memories begin to rewrite themselves. Details shift, dates blur, names flicker. It's as though the act of remembering is eroding the structure of the memory itself. The paradox deepens. By holding on, they may be losing it. They meet others, people online, in whispers, in passing, who confess to similar phenomena. A man who remembers marrying a woman who doesn't exist. A woman who speaks a language she never learned. A child who describes events from decades ago in impossible detail. Each of them clings to a reality that the world refuses to validate. And in this quiet network of fractured minds, the traveler finds solace. They are not alone, but they are still lost. Eventually, they encounter a theory that consciousness is not tied to one timeline, but floats between them. That when enough timelines collapse, through choice, through trauma, through anomaly, the residual consciousness carries forward echoes from the collapsed branches, phantom memories, emotional residue, anomalous recall. It is not a malfunction, it is a burden, a form of survivor's guilt for realities that no longer exist. This theory settles into the traveler like a heavy truth. They begin to see memory not as a record, but as a shadow, not of what happened here, but of what might have, what nearly did, what did in some adjacent version of now. They stop trying to reconcile it, they start to listen. Each phantom memory becomes a message from a path not taken, a lesson without context, a love that once was, now echoing through the silence. Their relationship with time shifts. They stop expecting linearity. They begin to honor the fragments. When a memory arises that doesn't belong, they do not fight it. They sit with it, let it speak, let it cry, let it pass. They start to live gently, aware that every moment might carry the ghosts of many. Every smile might echo a grief. Every silence might once have been filled. And slowly, something soft returns. Not normalcy, but peace. They stop needing proof. They stop chasing validation. They begin to live a life where multiple truths can coexist, where memory is not a single thread, but a tapestry of what was, what could have been, and what lingers beyond both. They speak less, but when they do, their words are precise, because they've learned how fragile memory is, how sacred, how full of contradiction. The phantom memory paradox does not resolve. It hums in the background of consciousness like a song almost remembered. It reminds us that the self is not a single timeline, that the mind may carry echoes far beyond what the body has lived, that love, loss, and identity may stretch across dimensions we cannot chart, and that sometimes the most painful memories are not the ones that happened, but the ones that once did, and then were taken away. So if you ever feel a grief you cannot name, if you ever wake with a memory too sharp to be imagined, if you ever miss someone who has never met you, remember the traveler. Remember that memory is more than evidence, it is existence. And even the moments we cannot prove may still have shaped who we are. You are not broken for remembering things that never happened. You are not lost for mourning a past that no one else recalls. You are simply tuned to a deeper frequency, one that hears the echoes of all that reality has let go, and in honoring those echoes, you give them a home again, not in the world, but in your heart. Quietly, unshakably, real. The paradox of emotional origin. We think of emotions as responses, as reactions to what has happened or what we believe might happen. Fear when danger appears, joy when we're loved, regret when a choice turns sour. But the more we examine the landscape of emotion, the stranger it becomes. Sometimes we feel grief before the loss, longing before we've known what we miss, guilt without action, love without history. And in those moments a question begins to surface. Where did this come from? Not the situation, but the feeling itself. What is the true origin of emotion? And if that origin cannot be found, is the emotion still real? This is where the paradox of emotional origin begins. It starts with a simple sensation, a wave of sadness on a clear morning, with no discernible cause. The traveler pauses, curious more than concerned. There's no event to explain the weight in their chest, no memory pressing at the edges of their mind, just the quiet ache of something unnameable. They brush it off, tell themselves it's nothing, a mood, an echo of a dream. But the feeling lingers. It returns in different forms at different times. A sudden anxiety before a calm meeting, a spike of elation in the middle of stillness, an unshakable guilt when all seems well. They begin to ask others, friends, therapists, partners, have you ever felt something before the thing that causes it? And to their surprise, people nod. Yes, all the time. Joy that doesn't belong, grief that arrives too early, shame with no crime. It becomes clear that emotions do not always follow cause. Sometimes they precede it. Sometimes they emerge from nowhere. And in that nowhere, meaning becomes slippery. The traveler starts keeping a journal, a log of feelings disconnected from facts. They write about the moments when their emotional landscape makes no sense. But patterns emerge. Emotions that come in cycles, sensations that feel like memories from a life not lived, feelings that align not with the present, but with a future that hasn't arrived. And this realization cracks the ground beneath them, because they've always believed that emotions are signals, useful, explainable. Now they feel like messages with no sender. They try to trace the emotions backward to find their roots. A wave of melancholy. Was it a song they overheard? A color on a wall? A forgotten scent? Sometimes, yes, but more often, no. The origin refuses to reveal itself. It hides in the folds of time, beyond logic, and they begin to wonder, what if the emotion is the origin? What if it arises first, shaping our interpretation of the moment instead of the other way around. They test this. They enter a room while holding a strong, unexplained emotion, and they watch as the world molds itself to match. A neutral glance feels hostile when they carry fear. A quiet pause feels intimate when they carry love. The emotion colors the moment, not in hindsight, but in real time. And with that, the paradox sharpens. If emotions shape reality before reality shapes emotions, then which is the cause and which is the effect? They begin to feel untethered, not in a dramatic way, but subtly. Their inner world no longer follows the rules they were taught. They wake up already feeling something and then spend the day trying to reverse engineer the story to fit it. They feel like an actor handed a script in a language they don't speak, sensing the emotion of the lines but not the meaning. And sometimes, that emotion drives them to act, to reach out to someone they haven't spoken to in years, to apologize without knowing why, to cry before the loss, to love before the connection. And occasionally, they're right. The apology lands before the harm. The friend calls with bad news moments after they've already started grieving. They fall in love with someone who hasn't entered the room yet. It's as if their emotions are ripples from a stone not yet dropped. Their heart is echoing events before they occur. And this realization does not bring clarity, it brings complexity. Because now they wonder how much of what they feel is theirs and how much is from a timeline slightly ahead of them. They study neuroscience, hoping for grounding. They learn about misfiring synapses, memory loops, emotional tagging. But none of it explains the accuracy of the anticipatory emotions. None of it explains why a dread with no cause arrives just before an event, or why a joy arises hours before a gift is given. They begin to suspect that emotion is not tied strictly to time, that it operates on a curve rather than a line, that the heart sometimes knows before the mind can catch up. And so they shift how they live. They stop trying to justify their feelings. They start to trust them, not blindly, not as truth, but as information, as early signals, as echoes from directions the intellect cannot point toward. When sorrow arrives uninvited, they make space for it. When excitement bubbles without context, they follow it. They begin to experience emotion not as a reaction, but as a compass, and the world starts to open in strange ways. But the paradox never leaves. It deepens. Because the more they listen, the more they see how emotions mislead just as often as they guide. The love that felt so certain turns brittle. The fear that warned them holds no threat. The guilt that crushed them stems from an illusion. And they are left with a deeper question. Not just where do emotions come from, but why do we believe them when we don't know? They begin to live with two selves, the feeling self and the knowing self. One whispers constantly, urgent and wordless. The other waits patiently, looking for evidence. And most days, they do not agree. The traveler learns to walk between them, not denying either, but not worshiping either. They become a translator, moving between the language of the heart and the logic of the mind. And in that translation, they find peace. They stop demanding that every feeling make sense. They stop insisting that every joy be justified. They allow emotion to be its own origin, sometimes mysterious, sometimes premature, sometimes misplaced. And in that surrender, they begin to feel more deeply, not less, because now they are no longer afraid of emotions without names. They welcome the uninvited guests. They sit with feelings that do not announce their purpose. They learn to trust the heart's timing, even when it arrives early. And gradually something beautiful happens. Life becomes more textured, more honest. They notice how often people bury their feelings simply because they can't explain them. How often joy is delayed for fear of looking foolish. How often love is ignored because its cause can't be proven. The traveler begins to encourage others not to wait for permission to feel, to allow emotions to arise without apology, to treat the inner landscape as a living thing, not a courtroom. The paradox of emotional origin does not seek resolution. It invites intimacy. It teaches us that the heart has its own clocks, that sometimes we cry not because something is wrong, but because something is shifting, that sometimes love arrives before the story that will hold it, that fear is not always a warning, it is sometimes a memory from a version of us that did not survive. So, if you ever feel something you cannot name, if you wake with sadness that has no shape, or joy that has no face, remember the traveler. Remember that emotion does not always come with a cause, that sometimes the cause follows, and that in honoring what you feel, even when you don't understand it, you give voice to something older than reason. You are not broken for crying at silence. You are not lost for loving without reason. You are simply attuned to a part of yourself that exists beyond linear explanation. And in that attunement, there is depth, there is wisdom, there is grace. Because the soul, like music, does not ask to be understood, only to be heard, and emotion is the sound it makes, echoing through time. Sometimes early, sometimes late, but always real, always yours. Chrono-social isolation. Time travel promises freedom, the ability to slip between moments, to outpace regret, to rewrite loss, to revisit laughter, to rework mistakes, to explore eras beyond the reach of memory. But in its seductive glow lies a quieter shadow, a cost not counted in years but in connection, because while the traveler moves through time, others remain anchored. While the traveler leaps, the world stays behind, and slowly, unavoidably, the traveler begins to drift, not just through history, but away from humanity. This is the story of chrono-social isolation. It begins with wonder. The traveler discovers how to move through time, not metaphorically, but literally. They jump hours, then days, then decades. The world opens like a map, and every moment becomes accessible. They see empires rise and fall, witness revolutions, hear the songs of extinct birds. They walk through the quiet streets of ancient cities and stand in crowds that do not yet know the weight of tomorrow. The experience is breathtaking, and for a while, it feels like awakening. At first, they try to stay grounded. They visit the past and return in time for dinner with friends. They step into the future and return in time for morning coffee. But something changes. It's subtle. The conversations around them feel shallower. Friends speak of movies and traffic and work stress, and the traveler smiles politely, nods, but their mind is far away. It's hard to care about schedules when you've just stood at the edge of the Roman Empire's fall. Hard to fret about emails when you've watched civilizations bloom and vanish. They begin to feel the distance, not of miles, but of moments. Time no longer moves the same way for them. An hour spent in the present feels like a cage compared to the freedom of the centuries. They start arriving late, missing calls, forgetting birthdays, and though they promise they care, their presence feels thinner, less invested, because their heart is still anchored in another time. The laughter of friends sounds slightly off, their joys seem brief, their worries repetitive. And yet the traveler longs for connection. They miss their people, they miss the intimacy of shared experience. But now, when they speak of what they've seen, of standing beneath ancient moons, of watching tomorrow's skies, no one truly listens, or worse, they listen politely, but don't understand. Their stories sound like fiction. Their tone becomes distant. Their presence feels untethered. Slowly, their words are met with silence, then skepticism, then absence. Friends begin to drift, not out of malice, but because they can't keep pace with someone who no longer walks within the same river of time. The traveler tries to explain, tries to ground their stories in emotion, in metaphor, but the gap remains. Because there are no metaphors for having lived 1,000 lives while others have only lived one. There is no shared language for what it feels like to speak to your great-grandparents and then eat lunch in a digital future. The traveler becomes too much, or too little. And either way, they are alone. They try to form new bonds, to meet people in different centuries, a poet in the 1600s, a scientist in the 2100s, a quiet healer in a village long gone, and for a while, these connections bring relief, but even they cannot last, because the traveler does not stay. They are always moving. The very gift of time travel, the freedom to leave, becomes the wall between them and everyone else. Every connection has an expiration. Every bond is temporary. Time, once infinite, becomes a cycle of hellos. Eventually, the traveler stops trying to explain themselves. They stop speaking of time travel altogether. When asked where they've been, they smile and say, away. They keep their stories short, their tone neutral, and though they are surrounded by people, they begin to feel like a ghost, a presence without history, a stranger without context. They listen more and speak less, not out of humility, but out of fear that their truth will deepen the divide. They begin to question their own timeline. Who are they now? How many versions of themselves have they become? Are they still the friend who once laughed too loudly at midnight? Are they still the sibling who cried at a wedding? The lover who whispered promises on rooftops? Or are those selves scattered across centuries, fragments left in different years, forgotten by those who never moved? This fragmentation creates a quiet ache. The traveler longs not just for company, but for continuity, for someone to remember them across more than a few years, for someone to look into their eyes and say, I know who you are, and mean it. But no one can, because every time they leap, they shed context. They return older, changed, speaking in metaphors others cannot parse. They remember moments that were never shared. They carry griefs from losses no one else can mourn. They try to stop, to stay in one era, to let time move linearly again, and for a while, they manage. They build a life, make appointments, answer emails, plant a garden. But it never lasts. The pull is too strong. The curiosity, the ache for the elsewhere, the hum of other moments calling from beyond the veil. They slip again. Just one visit they promise, but one becomes many, and the rhythm of the present shatters once more. Eventually, they stop trying. They embrace their movement but accept its cost. They wander through time as one might wander through fog, alone, with memories as companions. They become a witness more than a participant, a recorder of details, a silent observer. They leave small marks in time, a poem scratched into a stone, a pressed flower left in a forgotten book, a coin placed beneath a floorboard, traces of a presence that no one will ever piece together. But something shifts as the years continue. The traveler begins to see loneliness not as punishment, but as perspective. They begin to listen to people without the need to belong. They sit with strangers in every era and learn their fears, their joys, their patterns. They stop trying to be known and start practicing presence. Deep, sincere presence. In doing so, the isolation lessens, not by erasing the distance, but by embracing it. They discover a different kind of connection, not rooted in shared time, but in shared humanity. A child's laugh sounds the same in every century. A tear for a lost love has the same weight, whether cried in 1812 or 3004. Pain is constant, wonder is constant, and though the traveler cannot stay, they can still care. They become a guardian of moments, a keeper of emotional echoes, and eventually people begin to feel something when they're near, even if they don't understand why. A calm presence, a feeling of being seen, a whisper of something eternal. The traveler stops needing to be remembered. They stop craving permanence. They offer kindness, then vanish. They become part of the mythologies of quiet lives. Chrono-social isolation is not just about loneliness. It is about the fracture between experience and belonging. It is the ache of witnessing too much and having no one to share it with. But it is also the lesson that presence does not require permanence. That connection can exist in seconds. That love can be given without needing to be held. So if you ever feel distant from those around you, if you carry moments too strange to explain, if you feel like a different version of yourself than those you love, remember the traveler. Remember that your path may not be shared, but it can still be felt. That even if no one walks beside you for long, the way you walk still matters. Because the paradox of time is not in its loops or leaps. It's in how we stay human across all of it. And sometimes, the kindest thing we can do is to sit quietly in the presence of another, even for a moment, and truly see them. Even if we cannot stay, even if we never meet again. To witness, to care, and to carry on. Because in the end, even the most isolated traveler leaves a trace, not in timelines, but in hearts.